For centuries, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain lived in relative peace, their monasteries untouched, their towns growing, their rulers focused on rivalries within their own land. But then everything changed. From the far north, across the cold and violent sea, came a force unlike any the English had ever seen. The year was 793 AD, and Britain was about to enter an age of war, fire, and steel. When the first Norse longships landed at Lindisfarne, they brought more than just war. They brought terror, they brought an unstoppable tide of warriors, ready to carve out their own kingdoms in foreign lands. The Anglo-Saxon world would never be the same again. The Viking Age had begun. For centuries, history books have told the story of Viking raids as little more than plunder and destruction, a wave of mindless violence that eventually faded away. But is that really the whole story? What if I told you that the Vikings weren't just raiders, that they weren't just plunderers, that is what they really wanted, was something far greater? Because the truth is, these Norse warriors didn't just come to burn monasteries and sail away. They came to stay, they came to rule, they came to reshape Britain itself. We will not sell nonsense in this video. We study these topics in depth to provide as much serious historical knowledge as possible. Neil Price, leading historian for Vikings history in his best-selling book, Children of Ash and Elm, writes, "The Vikings did not simply arrive, they transformed. They imposed their rule, reshaped the landscape, and left a legacy that echoes into the modern world." Their impact wasn't just felt in battle, but in law, language, and culture. The very foundation of what would become England was shaped, in part, by these Norse invaders. So how did they do it? How did a scattered force of warriors evolve into rulers of vast territories, carving out entire kingdoms within England? And how did the Anglo-Saxon world fight back? This is the story of the Viking invasions, a tale of blood and steel, of kings and warlords, of survival and transformation. And by the end of this video, you will see why the Vikings were far more than just raiders. Before we examine the first Viking raids in England, we must first understand the world from which these raiders emerged. In the late 8th century, Scandinavia was a fragmented, competitive landscape of warrior chieftains, tribal leaders, and emerging kings. Society was built on honor, loyalty, and the pursuit of reputation. Wealth and prestige were measured not just in land and goods, but in battle success, followers, and daring exploits abroad. Neil Price, in his seminal book Children of Ash and Elm, describes this world. The Vikings were not a people in the way we think of nations today. They were a network of interconnected clans and warbands, bonded by personal loyalty rather than central government. Their world was one of shifting alliances, fierce rivalries, and the constant need to prove oneself. The Scandinavian economy was largely agrarian, but recent archaeological finds suggest that trade networks stretched as far as Byzantium, the Caliphate, and the Volga River trade routes. Silver hoards unearthed in Sweden and Denmark contain Islamic dirhams, Frankish coins, and Anglo-Saxon artifacts, evidence of early contacts before full-scale Viking expansion. Vikings were not just warriors, they were merchants, shipbuilders, and explorers. The same men who raided monasteries one season might return to trade the next. The same ships that carried warbands to England also carried fur, amber, and iron to the markets of Francia and beyond. But in the late 8th century, something changed. Peter Sawyer, The Viking Expansion. The Vikings did not appear out of nowhere. Their early raids were not isolated incidents, but the result of long-standing contact with Europe, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. The Scandinavian population was growing, and rivalry among chieftains for wealth and power meant that ambitious men sought fortune across the sea. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne had expanded aggressively against the pagan Saxons, slaughtering thousands and forcefully converting them to Christianity. Some historians argue that Viking raids may have been a response, a strike against the Christian world that had encroached upon their lands and traditions. Janet L. Nelson, in The Frankish World 750 to 900, suggests the Viking Age began in the shadow of Charlemagne's wars. The brutal conquest of Saxony had not gone unnoticed in Scandinavia. In the eyes of the Norse, the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons were not just wealthy, they were enemies. It is in this context that we must view the first Viking attacks on Anglo-Saxon England. The first Viking raid on Anglo-Saxon England did not happen at Lindisfarne in 793. The earliest recorded Viking attack occurred 4 years earlier, in 789 AD, on the Isle of Portland, off the southern coast of Wessex. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, 3 ships from Hordaland, in modern Norway, landed on the shores of Portland. The local reeve, an official of King Beorhtric of Wessex, rode out to meet them. Believing them to be merchants, he ordered them to accompany him to the royal court. Instead, the Vikings drew their weapons and killed him on the spot. This small-scale skirmish did not raise widespread alarm. It was not a full-scale raid, but rather an encounter that foreshadowed what was to come. But the attack on Lindisfarne in 793 would change everything. Before the storm came ashore, there was only silence. A silence shaped not by fear, but by faith. A silence that echoed across the sacred halls of Lindisfarne, the holiest site in Northumbria. In the early 8th century, the small tidal island of Lindisfarne, known also as Holy Island, stood not as a military fortress or political seat, but as a beacon of Christian devotion. Located just off the northeastern coast of Northumbria, this modest island housed a monastery of exceptional significance. To the Anglo-Saxon world, Lindisfarne was a spiritual citadel, revered not for its size, but for its symbolic weight. Founded in 635 AD by the Irish monk Aidan, who was invited from the monastic community at Iona by King Oswald of Northumbria, Lindisfarne quickly evolved into the heart of the Christian mission in the north. Its monks followed a monastic life rooted in Celtic Christian tradition, emphasizing asceticism, missionary zeal, and a dedication to scriptural learning. According to historian Simon Keynes of the University of Cambridge, Lindisfarne was more than a monastic centre. It was an ideological stronghold, a projection of Northumbrian sanctity and sovereignty across a still fractured landscape. At the centre of Lindisfarne's growing renown was St. Cuthbert, who had been appointed bishop of the island in 685, and whose reputation for spiritual insight and healing power spread rapidly after his death. His relics, carefully enshrined within the monastery, drew pilgrims from across the kingdom. By the early 790s, Lindisfarne was not only a place of quiet devotion, but also a site of power, political, economic, and spiritual. Its rise to prominence was supported by royal patronage. Kings of Northumbria endowed the monastery with gifts, land, and protection. The community became known not only for its religious virtue, but for its possession of liturgical treasures, gold and silver chalices, elaborately bound gospel books, and valuable relics. These treasures were not mere displays of opulence. They were tangible signs of divine favour and Christian civilization. But this very sanctity made Lindisfarne vulnerable. As the 8th century drew to a close, the North Sea was no longer a barrier. It was becoming a highway for seaborne incursions. The Anglo-Saxon world was already showing signs of anxiety. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, an entry for the year 787, just 6 years before the Lindisfarne raid, describes the arrival of 3 ships of Northmen off the coast of Wessex. The local reeve, assuming they were traders, rowed out to greet them and was promptly killed. And in those days came first 3 ships of Northmen, and the reeve rode there and tried to compel them to go to the king's town, but they slew him. These were the first ships of Danish men that sought the land of the English. While that encounter was largely dismissed at the time as an isolated crime, a Kentish charter from 792 reveals that the Kingdom of Mercia had already begun preparing coastal defences against pagan seamen. This suggests that Anglo-Saxon rulers were becoming increasingly aware of a new threat emerging from the northern seas. Yet, it was not until the attack on Lindisfarne in 793 that the full cultural and religious weight of this threat was felt. Lindisfarne's isolation, once a source of sacred seclusion, now became a liability. The monastery was open, undefended, and easily accessible by sea. Its monks lived according to rules of humility and poverty, yet the accumulation of gifts and relics had turned the island into a repository of wealth. In the eyes of the Norse raiders, it was ripe for the taking. The Norse themselves, most likely Norwegians from the western fjords, were part of a seafaring culture with a long tradition of raiding coastal settlements. Though often described in early Christian sources as savage and godless, modern scholarship has taken a more nuanced view. Historian Peter Sawyer, professor at the University of Leeds, notes, "The Vikings were not irrational barbarians. Their raids had logic, economic, political, and social. The attack on Lindisfarne was opportunistic, yes, but it also marked the beginning of a strategic interest in the wealth and weakness of Christian kingdoms." In retrospect, the attack was inevitable, but to the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, it seemed apocalyptic. Alcuin of York, one of the most prominent intellectuals of the Carolingian Renaissance and a Northumbrian by birth, was residing at the court of Charlemagne in Francia when he received news of the raid. In his now famous letters to King Ethelred of Northumbria and Bishop Higbald of Lindisfarne, Alcuin gives voice to the deep theological despair of the time. Is this the beginning of greater suffering, or the outcome of the sins of those who live there? The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. His question, why did God allow this, echoed far beyond Northumbria. It framed the event not merely as a physical attack, but as a spiritual crisis. According to Janet L. Nelson, late Professor Emerita at King's College London, Alcuin interpreted Lindisfarne's fall through the lens of divine judgment. In doing so, he crystallized the anxiety of a Christian society unsure of its own righteousness. For the people of Northumbria, the attack did not signal the beginning of a long series of raids. It shattered the illusion that their world was divinely protected. Their most sacred place had fallen, and with it, a sense of spiritual security. To understand Lindisfarne before the raid, then, is to understand the depth of the shock that followed. It was not just a monastery that was attacked, it was a symbol, a cornerstone of Christian identity and divine order, and its violation marked a turning point, not just in the history of England but in the history of Europe. The silence that once reigned on Holy Island would never return. It began not with war drums, but with silence. Then came the sails, dark, unfamiliar, and closing fast. On June 8th, 793, the holy island of Lindisfarne was torn from its sacred stillness and thrust into legend. Though the precise moment of the Lindisfarne raid is lost to history, its emotional and spiritual impact was recorded in vivid, almost apocalyptic language. For generations, the monastery had stood as a place of divine reflection. But on that day, the very symbols of holiness, altars, relics, saints' bones, were defiled, looted, and left scattered in the blood of monks. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, though terse in its entry for the year, frames the attack in cosmic terms. Here were dreadful forewarnings come over the land of Northumbria. These were great flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. A great famine soon followed, and shortly after, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, the woeful inroads of heathen men destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne by fierce robbery and slaughter. Although the Chronicle places the raid in January, scholars generally agree this was a scribal error. Given favourable raiding conditions, navigability, and the testimony of other sources, the accepted date is June 8th, 793. But what made this event so terrifying was not merely the violence, it was the desecration. Pagan men had broken into the house of God and slaughtered its inhabitants. There was no glory in this, only horror. Simeon of Durham, writing in the 12th century, elaborates on the trauma in his Historia Regum. They laid everything waste with grievous plundering, trampled the holy places with polluted steps, dug up the altars, and seized all the treasures of the Holy Church. They carried off some of the brothers with them in fetters, others they drowned in the sea. While Simeon's account is written centuries after the event, its emotional power reflects a memory kept alive across generations, not merely of violence, but of shame and spiritual violation. To the Anglo-Saxon mind, this was more than a military failure. It was an unthinkable spiritual reversal. A place believed to be under divine protection had been defeated by unbelievers. Alcuin of York, in a letter to the King of Northumbria, wrote, "What assurance can the churches of Britain have if St. Cuthbert and so great a company of saints do not defend their own?" This rhetorical question was deeply unsettling. Lindisfarne housed the shrine of St. Cuthbert, a figure of immense holiness. To many in the Christian world, his presence should have made the island inviolable. And yet, the protection had failed. The saints had remained silent. Indeed, Northumbria was in a state of unrest. Only a few years earlier, King Elfwald had been assassinated, and the nobleman Sicca, implicated in the plot, died by suicide shortly after. Alcuin may have seen the raid as divine retribution, not unlike the biblical plagues visited upon sinful nations. Alcuin, in a letter to Bishop Higbold, "Behold the devastation of your house. It is the judgment of God for the sins of the people. Repent, lest worse follow." This view reflects a wider pattern in medieval Christian historiography. Disasters were not chance events, but moral consequences. The spiritual meaning of the raid overshadowed even the material destruction. At the same time, Lindisfarne's vulnerability was all too real. The monastery, like most early English religious communities, was undefended, built with no anticipation of organized external violence. Anglo-Saxon England had enjoyed relative insularity for decades. The idea of raiders appearing by sea, striking swiftly and vanishing with captives and gold was entirely new. Simon Keynes, University of Cambridge, notes, "The raid on Lindisfarne struck not merely at an isolated site, but at a structure of belief. The sanctity of the island, once unquestioned, was violated before the eyes of a watching world. What the Viking raiders found was, to them, practical: gold, books, relics, food, and frightened men. What they left behind was something else entirely, a theological and cultural scar that would mark the beginning of the Viking Age in the historical consciousness of Europe." It is important to clarify that this was not the first Viking contact with the British Isles. As outlined in Chapter 1, there were earlier, lesser-known encounters in 787. Yet, it was Lindisfarne that captured the imagination of chroniclers and clergy. Its destruction was symbolic. It told a story of insecurity, of impending threat, and of a shift in historical rhythm, from insular kingdoms to an era of sea-borne invasions and ideological confrontation. From a modern academic perspective, the Lindisfarne raid reveals the interplay between narrative, trauma, and history. It is not simply a tale of attackers and victims, it is the creation of a mythic origin point, a beginning. Peter Sawyer reminds us, "The idea that the Viking Age began in a single moment is a modern construct, but not an empty one." Lindisfarne was remembered because it mattered deeply to those who told its story. Thus, June 8th, 793 becomes more than a date. It becomes a threshold between peace and fear, between sacred order and heathen storm. And beyond the smoke of that ruined monastery, the horizon was filling with sails. The smoke had barely cleared over Lindisfarne before the tremors began. Across monasteries, courts and churches, a single question echoed. If this could happen to Lindisfarne, could anything be sacred? The raid of June 8th, 793 was a localized act of violence, but its resonance was immediate and far-reaching. News travelled quickly through Northumbria and beyond. Chroniclers, bishops and kings all reacted with disbelief and dread. What had once seemed unimaginable, an attack on a consecrated Christian sanctuary, was now a terrifying precedent. The psychological impact of the raid far outweighed the physical destruction. Lindisfarne was not simply a target, it was the spiritual capital of Northumbrian Christianity. It held the relics of St. Cuthbert, whose bones had worked miracles and whose shrine was believed to protect the island. The fact that the Vikings had desecrated such a place without apparent consequence left a deep scar on the Anglo-Saxon worldview. As historian Leslie Abrams of Oxford University explains, Lindisfarne's vulnerability was not merely strategic, it was theological. The raid confronted the faithful with a deeply unsettling possibility that divine protection could fail. This idea was almost too much for the early medieval mind to bear. In a world where sacred relics, holy places, and divine intercession were central to both individual and communal identity, the violation of Lindisfarne called into question the very structure of cosmic order. No one felt this more intensely than Alcuin of York, who continued to write with increasing urgency. His letters reveal a man gripped not only by grief but by moral despair. Writing again to Bishop Higbald, he pleaded, "What security can there be for the churches of Britain if St. Cuthbert and such a company of saints do not defend their own?" Alcuin interpreted the raid not as a test of faith, but as a punishment for sin. Without naming names, he subtly referred to the recent instability in Northumbria, especially the regicide of King Elfwald and the political violence that followed. Janet L. Nelson observes, "For Alcuin, the sacred and the secular were never far apart. The failure of divine protection was directly tied to the moral decay of the ruling class." In this light, the Viking raid became part of a theodicy, a spiritual narrative of sin, punishment, and the possibility, however faint, of repentance and renewal. But this was not merely a matter of internal reflection. Across Christendom, Lindisfarne was seen as a warning. Frankish chroniclers, influenced by Alcuin's correspondence, began to take the Viking threat more seriously. In Francia, Emperor Charlemagne had already begun to fortify coastal defences, particularly along the Channel. The Anglo-Saxon world, however, was less prepared, and the Vikings knew it. In the years that followed Lindisfarne, the pattern of monastic raids expanded rapidly. In 794, the monastery of Jarrow, also in Northumbria, was attacked, another site associated with early English Christianity and the legacy of the scholar Bede. By 795, the famous island monastery of Iona, ancestral home of the Lindisfarne mission, was also struck. Nowhere was safe. What united these early targets was their symbolic and material value. They were wealthy, isolated, and unprotected, but also central to the identity of Christian kingdoms. As historian Peter Sawyer puts it, the Vikings were drawn not simply by silver, but by what silver represented: power, faith, vulnerability. Their choice of targets was tactical, but also psychological. It is significant that Viking attacks began with raids rather than invasions. The mobility of Norse ships, their knowledge of the coasts, and their ability to strike quickly and retreat made them difficult to resist. At this stage, their objective was not to conquer territory, but to destabilize, plunder, and test the limits of Christian resistance. The Anglo-Saxon political response, however, was slow and fragmented. Northumbria, already weakened by internal feuding, was in no position to retaliate. Mercia and Wessex began to improve their coastal defences, but coordination was limited, and without a clear understanding of who the raiders were or where they came from, there was little chance of meaningful deterrence. At this point, most scholars agree that the raiders were Norwegian, not Danish. Their approach across the North Sea suggests a base in the western fjords, possibly from the area around modern-day Rogaland or Hordaland. Later, Viking activity in England, particularly the Great Heathen Army in the 860s, would be dominated by Danes, but these early attacks were more spontaneous, seasonal, and opportunistic. Still, their long-term consequences were profound. The shock of Lindisfarne became a historical inflection point, remembered not only by chroniclers, but by generations of English rulers, clerics, and warriors. Simon Keynes argues, "The symbolic value of Lindisfarne exceeded the sum of its relics and buildings. Its destruction marked the end of an era of Anglo-Saxon confidence, of divine certainty, and of insularity." From 793 onward, England was no longer isolated from the wider world. It was connected by fear, violence, and opportunity to a northern seascape that included Scandinavia, Ireland, and the Frankish coasts. The North Sea was no longer a boundary. It was a highway, and Lindisfarne was its first toll station. In this new age, monasteries would fall, kings would rise and fall, and entire kingdoms would be redrawn. But none of that had yet begun on that early summer morning in 793. There was only an island, a sacred relic, and a fleet on the horizon. History rarely marks its turning points so clearly, but with the raid on Lindisfarne, a new age did not merely begin. It announced itself with fire, blood, and silence. The attack on Lindisfarne was the first of many. In the decades that followed, Viking raids expanded across the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and France. Monasteries, often centres of wealth and culture, were prime targets. They were isolated, ill-defended, and rich in sacred objects, silver, books, and food. And like Lindisfarne, they were symbolic sites. Their destruction meant more than material loss. It eroded the very scaffolding of early medieval Christian identity. In 794, the monastery of Jarrow, home of Bede's intellectual legacy, was attacked. In 795, Norse raiders struck Iona, the cradle of Irish-Scottish monasticism and spiritual origin of Lindisfarne itself. Over the next few decades, the coasts of East Anglia, Kent, and Mercia were repeatedly harried. By the mid-9th century, the Viking threat had evolved from seasonal raiding into full-scale military conquest. The so-called Great Heathen Army, arriving in 865, marked the next phase: invasion, not plunder. As historian Peter Sawyer notes, the Viking Age evolved from sporadic lightning raids into a sweeping reconfiguration of power. The same Norse seafarers who once fled with a few monks in chains returned to claim whole kingdoms. The transformation was not limited to warfare. The cultural and religious world of Anglo-Saxon England was forced to adapt. The Christian view of divine protection was shaken. In response, monastic communities began to move inland or fortify their holdings. Royal power shifted increasingly toward rulers who could protect church lands and offer a measure of military resistance. In time, this pressure would forge powerful monarchs like Alfred the Great, who not only resisted Viking advances but redefined kingship as the defender of both the realm and the faith. But that chapter would come later. In 793, England was not prepared. Historian Simon Keynes writes, "The shock of Lindisfarne was not merely political or military. It forced a rethinking of the relationship between sacred space and secular power." From that point forward, kings who failed to protect monasteries risked losing more than favour. They risked losing legitimacy. The Viking Age, which had its symbolic genesis at Lindisfarne, would eventually reach across all of Europe. Norse warriors sailed down the Seine, raided Paris, burned churches along the Rhine, and established the Duchy of Normandy. Others turned eastward, founding trade networks and principalities along the rivers of Rus. Some became mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire. The same people who desecrated the shrine of St. Cuthbert would later commission runestones, coinage, and Christian churches of their own. And yet, for all that followed, the memory of Lindisfarne endured. It became the origin myth of Viking terror and Christian resilience, a focal point for both fear and reform. Later chroniclers, like Simeon of Durham, would expand the tale, emphasizing the humiliation and horror of the event. Artists and scribes placed the raid at the beginning of manuscripts and genealogies, anchoring the story of a people in a moment of fire and crisis. Leslie Abrams explains, "The memory of Lindisfarne was cultivated not only as historical fact, but as a moral parable. It served to remind future generations of the fragility of peace, the consequences of complacency, and the price of sin. In this way, the event transcended its physical reality. The monastery was rebuilt, the relics of St. Cuthbert were rescued, eventually moved to Durham, where his cult was revived and strengthened. The Northumbrian church re-emerged, though scarred, and forged a new relationship with its rulers, one based not only on holiness, but on protection. But the legacy of Lindisfarne did not fade with the Middle Ages. In modern historiography, it remains a marker, a bold line across the timeline of Europe. It is not remembered as one of many raids, but as the moment when the Viking Age began. As James Campbell observed, what Lindisfarne represents is not the beginning of violence, but the end of innocence. It changed how Anglo-Saxons understood the world and how we remember it. June 8th, 793, a date that lives in the deep memory of Europe, not for a battle won or a king crowned, but for the moment when the tide turned. What began as a single raid on a sacred island evolved into 2 centuries of transformation. Kingdoms would rise and fall, new cultures would be born, and amid it all the memory of Lindisfarne remained, a symbol of both destruction and rebirth. The Viking Age was not simply an age of terror, it was an age of contact, of resistance, of exchange, and of resilience. And it began here, on a wind-swept shore off the coast of Northumbria. After Lindisfarne, Viking attacks became more frequent and more organized. 794 AD, the monastery of Jarrow was raided. 795 AD, the Scottish monastery of Iona was sacked. 841 AD, Dublin was founded by Vikings, establishing a permanent Norse presence in Ireland. By the early 9th century, the Viking raiders evolved their strategy. Instead of simple hit-and-run raids, Viking warbands began to overwinter in England. The first known Viking winter camp was established in 851 AD in the Isle of Thanet. This signaled a shift. The Vikings were no longer just raiders, but invaders and settlers. Gareth Williams, Viking Britain, an exploration. By the mid-9th century, Viking raids were no longer seasonal affairs. They were strategic, planned, and in many cases intended for long-term occupation. Anglo-Saxon kings, divided and weakened by internal rivalries, struggled to mount a unified defence. Some, like King Ethelred of Northumbria, attempted to resist but were crushed. Others, like the rulers of East Anglia, chose to pay tribute rather than fight. This period set the stage for the greatest Viking invasion of all, the arrival of the great heathen army in 865 AD. The first Viking attacks on Anglo-Saxon England were devastating, but they were only the beginning. What started as small-scale raids would soon evolve into a full-scale war for the control of England. As the 9th century dawned, the Norse set their sights not just on gold, but on land, power, and conquest. The storm was just beginning. The early Viking raids on Anglo-Saxon England were not random acts of mindless plunder. They were calculated, strategic, and adaptive. What began as sporadic, small-scale attacks in the late 8th century quickly transformed into a systematized, large-scale military strategy by the mid-9th century. The reasons behind this transformation were complex, rooted in both internal Scandinavian developments and external opportunities presented by a divided England. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, describes the Viking expansion as a tidal wave of ambition, violence, and necessity born from a society where war and wealth were intertwined. To raid was to thrive, to conquer was to become immortal. This section explores how Viking raiding evolved from isolated coastal strikes into a sustained campaign of terror and control, fundamentally reshaping Anglo-Saxon England. The first Viking raids had been quick, opportunistic strikes on poorly defended monasteries and villages. These were not wars of conquest, at least not yet. Instead, they were probing attacks designed to test the weaknesses of the Anglo-Saxon world. What made Viking raids so effective? Several key advantages made early Viking raids devastatingly successful. The element of surprise. Anglo-Saxon rulers had no warning systems or standing armies ready to respond. Monasteries, trade centres, and villages were unprepared for sudden attacks. Superior mobility. The longship. Viking longships were faster, lighter, and more maneuverable than any ship in England. They could land anywhere: beaches, riverbanks, marshes, avoiding heavily guarded ports. Unlike traditional armies, Vikings did not need roads. They used rivers as highways, penetrating deep into Anglo-Saxon territory before anyone knew they were there. Tactical precision. Vikings targeted rich, undefended locations, particularly monasteries. Unlike Anglo-Saxon armies, which fought in pitched battles, Viking forces relied on ambushes, deception, and lightning-fast retreats. Psychological warfare. The deliberate destruction of monasteries was meant to shock and demoralize the Anglo-Saxons. Stories of monks being slaughtered and churches burned spread rapidly, creating fear and hesitation among local rulers. The belief that these raiders were a punishment from God led many Anglo-Saxons to turn to prayer rather than military action. Eleanor Parker in Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England explains, the Vikings did not just kill their victims, they shattered the very idea of security. No king, no fortress, no divine protection could stop them. Their raids struck at the heart of Anglo-Saxon identity. The first Anglo-Saxon responses to Viking raids were weak and ineffective. The reasons for this failure were twofold: political disunity. Unlike the centralized Carolingian Empire in Francia, Anglo-Saxon England was divided into multiple rival kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia. These kingdoms often fought each other more than they fought the Vikings. This meant that when one kingdom was attacked, the others often did nothing, assuming it was not their problem. Peter Sawyer in the Viking Expansion notes, "The fragmentation of Anglo-Saxon England was the Vikings' greatest advantage. As long as the kings and ealdormen remained divided, the Norse were free to strike at will." And the second reason was a lack of military infrastructure. No standing army. Kings had to summon local warriors, the feared, whenever an invasion occurred, a process that took weeks, by which time the Vikings had already looted and left. No naval defences. England had no warships capable of intercepting Viking fleets. No fortifications. Most English towns were open settlements with no defensive walls, making them easy targets. The Vikings had recognized these weaknesses early on, and they exploited them relentlessly. By the 820s, the Vikings had grown bolder. Their targets expanded beyond monasteries to include royal estates, direct attacks on the wealth of Anglo-Saxon kings and nobles, market towns, disrupting trade and crippling the economy, inland villages, proving that no part of England was safe. A crucial change occurred in 830 when Viking fleets began raiding deeper into the countryside. Instead of single raids, multiple Viking warbands now coordinated attacks on different regions simultaneously. This shift marked the transition from isolated plundering to a systematic war economy, where raiding became a permanent cycle of looting, enslaving, and demanding tribute. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Canute the Great, writes, "What had once been seasonal raiding became an industry, one that fed wealth and power back into Scandinavia, fueling further expeditions." At this stage, many Anglo-Saxon rulers began paying tribute, Darngeld, rather than fighting. This decision to buy off the Vikings would have disastrous consequences in the decades to come. One reason Viking raiding continued to escalate was because of how it fundamentally shaped Scandinavian society. Younger sons of noble families who had no land to inherit took to the seas to gain wealth and reputation. Warriors who succeeded abroad returned home as powerful leaders, gaining influence in their local communities. Norse mythology glorified warriors who died in battle, reinforcing the idea that raiding was not just about wealth. It was a path to honour. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, describes this mindset. A Viking's reputation was his most prized possession. To die unknown was to die twice. To carve one's name into history through battle, through raiding, through fearless deeds, was to achieve true immortality. For many Vikings, plundering England was not just a means of survival, it was their destiny. By the early 850s, the Viking strategy had evolved yet again. They were no longer seasonal raiders. They were staying for longer periods, wintering in England and establishing semi-permanent bases. Their fleet sizes increased, allowing for larger, more coordinated assaults. They had discovered that tribute payments were as valuable as plunder, leading to massive economic exploitation of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxons were beginning to understand the scale of the threat they faced, but by the time they realized it, it was too late. The great heathen army was coming. In the decades following the Lindisfarne raid of 793, Viking activity in Anglo-Saxon England escalated dramatically. Initially, these attacks were sporadic, carried out by small bands of warriors looking for quick wealth. But by the 820s and 830s, Viking incursions became increasingly systematic, larger in scale, and more sophisticated. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England, describes this shift. The first Viking raids were like lightning strikes, sudden, unpredictable, and devastating. But by the early 9th century, the Norse had transformed these raids into a carefully honed system of warfare, one that would bring Anglo-Saxon England to its knees. This transformation was driven by several key factors: experience and intelligence gathering. Early raids had revealed which sites were the richest and least defended. More warriors and larger fleets. As Viking success stories spread, more men joined these expeditions, swelling the ranks of raiding parties. The development of overwintering camps. Instead of returning home each winter, Viking warbands began establishing semi-permanent bases in England and Ireland. Political instability in Anglo-Saxon England, internal conflicts between kings and rival kingdoms left the land vulnerable to outside attack. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, writes, "The Vikings quickly learned that England was a land divided, and where division existed, opportunity followed. With no unified resistance, they could strike at will, exploiting political rivalries to their advantage." This section will examine the evolution of Viking raids in the 794 to 830 period, focusing on their growing sophistication, new targets, and how the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms attempted, unsuccessfully, to resist. After the Lindisfarne attack in 793, Viking warbands wasted no time in launching follow-up raids on other Anglo-Saxon and Celtic sites. Key Viking raids, 794 to 806. 794, Jarrow Monastery raided, home of the late Bede, a revered Anglo-Saxon scholar. 795, Vikings attacked Iona Abbey in Scotland, signalling their expansion westward. 798, raids along the Cornish and Welsh coasts, showing early Norse interest in the Celtic world. 802 and 806, the monastery at Iona was attacked again, with over 68 monks slaughtered in a single raid. The repeated targeting of monasteries was no accident. These were centers of wealth, containing gold and silver religious artifacts, as well as books and illuminated manuscripts bound in decorated leather and studded with jewels. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, notes, "Monasteries were not just economic targets, they were symbolic ones. By striking at the heart of Christianity, the Vikings sent a clear message: no place, no faith, no king was beyond their reach." But monasteries were only the beginning. By the 800s and 10s, the Vikings had expanded their targets beyond monasteries. Now they turned their attention to towns, ports, and key trade routes, dealing a devastating blow to England's nascent economy. New Viking target categories, trade settlements and market towns, major river ports, royal estates and aristocratic manors. These new targets revealed a shift in Viking strategy. They were no longer just looting religious centres, they were crippling the economic infrastructure of England. They attacked the wealth of kings and noble families, forcing them into submission. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, explains, by targeting the trade networks of Anglo-Saxon England, the Vikings achieved a secondary victory, economic warfare. It was not just about the silver they stole, but the disruption they caused. One of the most significant Viking attacks of this period occurred in 841, when Viking ships sailed up the Thames and plundered London. This marked the first time the Vikings had attacked one of England's largest cities, a clear indication of their growing ambitions. The first Viking strongholds were formed in Dublin and Chepé from 835 to 841. Dublin, for example, was founded in 841. In Ireland, Viking warriors established a permanent base at Dublin, which became one of the most important Norse settlements in the British Isles. This allowed for constant raids on England from across the Irish Sea. Isle of Sheppey was attacked in 835. This was the first recorded Viking raid on the Kingdom of Kent. Sheppey's strategic position in the Thames estuary made it a prime location for future invasions. Gareth Williams, in Viking Britain, An Exploration, describes the importance of these new bases. By securing a permanent foothold in Ireland and along the English coast, the Vikings gained something they had never had before, staging grounds for larger invasions. This shift in Viking activity forced the Anglo-Saxons to rethink their approach to defence. As Viking attacks became more frequent and devastating, the Anglo-Saxon rulers struggled to respond effectively. Their main challenges were lack of coordination. Each Anglo-Saxon kingdom acted independently, failing to form a unified defence. When one kingdom was attacked, others often stood by, seeing it as someone else's problem. Slow military mobilization. The Anglo-Saxon army, known as the Fyrd, was not a professional standing force. By the time local lords could summon their warriors, the Vikings had already looted and left. Failure to defend. Key rivers and ports. The Anglo-Saxons did not have a navy to intercept Viking fleets. They also failed to fortify river towns and coastal settlements, allowing Vikings to strike deep inland with ease. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, argues that the Anglo-Saxons were still fighting battles in the old way, large, set-piece engagements, while the Vikings fought in a new way, rapid, mobile, unpredictable warfare. This failure to adapt led to massive territorial losses in the decades ahead. By the end of the 830s, Viking raids on England had expanded from monasteries to trade centres and cities, established key bases in Ireland and the Thames estuary, exposed the military and political weaknesses of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the worst was yet to come. In the 800s and 50s, the Vikings would take the final step toward permanent conquest, staying through the winter, establishing armies, and bringing England to the brink of collapse. The great heathen army was on the horizon. By the 830s, Viking warfare in England had undergone a critical transformation. What had begun as seasonal raids on coastal monasteries and villages had now evolved into a strategic campaign of inland penetration. Instead of simply attacking and retreating, the Vikings began pushing deeper into Anglo-Saxon territory using England's vast network of rivers. This new phase of Viking expansion marked the shift from hit-and-run piracy to sustained economic and military pressure on England's heartlands. Eleanor Parker in Dragonlords, The History and Legends of Viking England writes, "The rivers of England were not barriers to Viking invasion. They were highways of war. With their longships, the Norsemen could strike deep into the heart of Anglo-Saxon England, bypassing defences and taking the fight to the very doorstep of the English kings." This chapter explores how the Vikings adapted their strategy, how their ability to navigate England's rivers made nowhere safe, and how Anglo-Saxon rulers failed to counter this threat effectively. In the early 830s, Viking leaders recognized that England's greatest weakness was not just its lack of a united defense, but also its geography. Four key advantages of river raiding: access to the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. England's major towns and trade centres were located along navigable rivers: London on the Thames, York on the Ouse, Nottingham on the Trent. By sailing up these rivers, the Vikings could bypass natural coastal defences and strike deeper inland. Surprise and speed Anglo-Saxon armies could not move as fast as Viking longships. A Viking warband could raid a town, plunder it, and escape before the local fyrd militia could be summoned. No naval resistance. The Anglo-Saxons had no organized navy capable of patrolling the rivers. Even major cities like London and York had no fleets to intercept Viking raiders. Richer, more valuable targets. Coastal monasteries had been plundered repeatedly and were no longer the wealthiest targets. Towns and trade centres offered far greater rewards, including gold, silver, livestock and slaves. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, emphasises the importance of this shift. With the rivers open to them, the Vikings no longer had to settle for monasteries and villages. Now, they could take the wealth of entire kingdoms. By the late 830s, Viking fleets were no longer just raiding. They were coordinating large-scale operations across multiple regions. Key river raids of the 830s and 840s, 835. First recorded Viking attack on the Thames, Kent. A Viking fleet sailed up the Thames, raiding towns and monasteries along its banks. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, "A great host of heathens came up the river and spread ruin upon the land." This was the first confirmed instance of Vikings using England's river system to strike inland. 841, Viking sack of London, Rochester and Southampton, London, one of England's largest and wealthiest cities, was attacked by Viking longships sailing up the Thames. Rochester, a key defensive stronghold, was besieged and burned. Southampton, an important trading port with Francia, was plundered and left in ruins. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, describes the impact of the London raid. The sacking of London in 841 was a wake-up call. This was no longer a problem of coastal defences. This was a direct challenge to the economic and political stability of Anglo-Saxon England. This was the moment when Viking raids transformed from an annoyance to an existential threat. By the early 850s, Viking forces no longer raided and left immediately. They began to stay longer, overwintering and preparing for further campaigns. Key turning point: the Isle of Sheppey, 800s and 50s. Located at the mouth of the Thames, the Isle of Sheppey became the first recorded Viking winter base in England. Instead of retreating to Scandinavia, Viking warriors built temporary fortifications, allowing them to launch raids earlier in the year. This shift marked the beginning of permanent Viking settlements in England. Gareth Williams, in Viking Britain, An Exploration, highlights the strategic importance of these bases. With bases like Sheppey, the Vikings could now raid England year-round. They no longer needed to return home, they were home. This would have massive consequences, setting the stage for the Great Heathen Army's full-scale invasion in 865. The shift to river raiding and overwintering should have forced the Anglo-Saxon rulers to adapt. Instead, their response was slow, disorganized, and ultimately ineffective. Three major failures of the Anglo-Saxon response. Failure to build a navy. Even after repeated Viking attacks via the rivers, no serious attempt was made to build a fleet to intercept the Norse ships. King Ethelwulf of Wessex tried to launch small-scale naval operations, but these were too little, too late. Failure to fortify towns and river ports. Unlike the Franks, who began fortifying their towns under Charlemagne, the Anglo-Saxons left their river cities vulnerable. London was raided multiple times, proving that its defences were inadequate. Political disunity and weak leadership. The kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia failed to coordinate any joint response to the Viking threat. Instead of preparing for long-term war, many rulers simply paid the Vikings tribute, Danegeld, to go away. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, describes this as a critical failure of leadership. The Anglo-Saxon kings reacted as though the Viking threat was temporary, when in reality it was only growing stronger. By the end of the 800s and 50s, Viking warbands had transformed from coastal raiders into river-based invaders, established permanent winter camps for sustained campaigns, exposed the complete military failure of Anglo-Saxon England. The Vikings had mastered England's geography, and the Anglo-Saxon world had no effective answer. The next step would be full-scale invasion. The great heathen army was about to arrive. By the early 850s, it had become painfully clear that the Vikings were not going away. They had shifted from coastal raiders to river-borne invaders, striking deep into Anglo-Saxon territory. They had pillaged and burned major cities, including London and Rochester. They had established winter camps on English soil, ensuring that each year's raids would begin earlier and last longer. The Anglo-Saxon response to this crisis was disorganized, inconsistent, and often ineffective. Some kings fought back with military force, while others paid tribute, Danegeld, to buy temporary peace. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, describes this period as a time of desperation in which Anglo-Saxon rulers had to choose between futile resistance or humiliating submission, and all too often they chose the latter. This chapter explores the Anglo-Saxon response to the Viking onslaught, focusing on their military campaigns, fortification efforts, and the controversial policy of paying off the Norse invaders. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England, explains, unlike the Franks, who had the centralized power of Charlemagne, the Anglo-Saxons were divided and weak. This gave the Vikings a golden opportunity to exploit. First, major battles against the Vikings' Battle of Carhampton, 840 AD, Wessex versus Vikings. King Ethelwulf of Wessex led an army against a Viking warband that had established a base in Somerset. The battle was inconclusive, and the Vikings continued their raids on Wessex for years. Battle of Aclea, 851 AD, Wessex versus Vikings. King Ethelwulf's son, Ethelbald, led a major victory against the Norse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it as a great slaughter of the heathen army such as never before had been seen in this land. Despite this victory, the Vikings kept returning, proving that individual battles could not stop them. As Viking attacks continued to escalate, some Anglo-Saxon rulers began negotiating with the Norse instead of fighting them. This led to the rise of Danegeld, a ransom paid to Viking leaders in exchange for temporary peace. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, describes Danegeld as a desperate measure, but a logical one. If the Anglo-Saxons could not defeat the Vikings in battle, then at least they could pay them to leave. Immediate relief. Paying off the Vikings stopped raids in the short term, sparing towns from destruction. Lack of military options. Anglo-Saxon rulers did not have the forces to wage long-term war against the Norse. Viking leaders were willing to negotiate. The Vikings were not just warriors, but pragmatic businessmen. If they could get gold without fighting, they often accepted it. Judith Jesch, in Women in the Viking Age, explains, Danegeld was not just a ransom, it became a business model. Viking leaders realized that threatening to raid was just as profitable as raiding itself. Major Danegeld payments in the 850s, King Ethelwulf of Wessex 854 AD, paid a huge sum of silver to a Viking fleet threatening Wessex. The Vikings left temporarily but returned the next year. King Burgred of Mercia, 860 AD. After Viking forces sacked London, Burgred paid them off rather than fight. Mercia remained vulnerable to further attacks, proving that Danegeld was only a temporary solution. This cycle of paying off the Vikings, only for them to return later, would plague England for decades. By the mid-800s and 50s, some Anglo-Saxon kings finally recognized that tribute payments were not enough. They began to build fortified towns and defensive structures to resist Viking incursions. First, fortified burhs, early Wessex defences, 860s. Small walled enclosures were built around important towns. These provided temporary shelter for civilians during Viking raids. However, these early burhs were rudimentary and did not prevent major invasions. Mercia's failed fortifications, 860s. King Burgred attempted to fortify the River Trent to stop Viking longships, but his defences were not properly manned, and the Vikings easily bypassed them. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, notes, "The Anglo-Saxons were slow to understand what the Franks had already learned. The only way to resist the Vikings was to fortify every major town and create an organized military response." Despite some victories and defensive efforts, the Anglo-Saxon response to the Vikings remained ineffective throughout the 850s. Tribute payments only encouraged more invasions. Fortifications were too weak and too few. Military resistance was uncoordinated and inconsistent. And then, in 865 AD, the worst-case scenario became a reality. A massive Viking invasion force, known as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia, not to raid, but to conquer. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, writes, "The Anglo-Saxon kings had spent decades treating the Vikings as a nuisance. But the Great Heathen Army was no raiding party. It was an organized military force, and it was here to stay." The years of tribute and scattered resistance had failed. Now, England would face its greatest test of survival. Despite the failures of the 850s, the Anglo-Saxons still had one last chance to unite against the Norse threat. But in 865 AD, everything changed. A massive Viking invasion force, later known as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. Unlike previous Viking fleets, this was not a raiding party. It was a coordinated military campaign designed for full-scale conquest. Led by legendary warriors such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, the Great Heathen Army would march across England, toppling kingdoms and shattering the old order. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Canute the Great, writes, "The Great Heathen Army was the moment when everything changed. The Viking Age in England entered a new phase, one of occupation, settlement, and the redefinition of Anglo-Saxon rule." Peter Sawyer, in The Viking Expansion, argues, "The Anglo-Saxon kings had failed to recognize the true scale of the Viking threat. The Great Heathen Army would teach them a lesson they would never forget." The Viking Age in England had begun with sporadic raids, but by the late 800s and 50s, it had become a full-blown crisis. Viking armies were no longer raiders, they were conquerors. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had failed to unite against the Norse. Permanent Viking bases were now established in England. And now, in 865 AD, the Great Heathen Army had arrived. The question was no longer if the Anglo-Saxons would resist, but how long they could survive. In the final months of 865 AD, a fleet of hundreds of longships appeared off the eastern coast of England. These were not the small raiding parties that had terrorized Anglo-Saxon England for nearly a century. This was something altogether different, a massive, organized force of Viking warriors, known to history as the Great Heathen Army, Mysel here in Old English. For decades, the Anglo-Saxons had struggled to deal with the Viking menace. Each summer, swift Norse warbands would descend upon their shores, attacking monasteries, villages, and towns. These incursions were devastating, but they were at least predictable. The Vikings would raid for a season, collect their plunder, and return home before winter. But this new force did not arrive to plunder and retreat. It had come to conquer and stay. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, describes the moment with chilling clarity. The arrival of the great heathen army marked a transition in Viking warfare. This was no longer a war of raids. It was a war of occupation. The Vikings had spent years testing England's weaknesses. Now they meant to claim it. The sheer scale of the invasion stunned contemporary chroniclers. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of English history kept by monks, described the fleet in ominous terms. A great host of heathen men came to the land of the English and took winter quarters among them, seeking to overthrow the land and rule it as their own. Unlike previous Viking expeditions, this was a cohesive, well-planned military campaign. It had clear leadership, strategic objectives, and an army large enough to challenge entire kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxons, still divided among rival rulers, had no idea how to respond. The exact size of the great heathen army is unknown. Later medieval sources, such as the 12th century historian Simeon of Durham, claimed it numbered tens of thousands. Modern historians, however, estimate that the initial force may have consisted of between 3,000 and 5,000 warriors, though reinforcements would arrive in the following years. What made this army particularly dangerous was the experience of its warriors. Many of these Vikings were battle-hardened veterans who had fought for decades across Europe. Vikings from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had spent years in Francia, fighting under and against the Carolingians. Others had fought in Ireland, where Viking strongholds, like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, had been established as powerful Norse trading hubs. Many had served as mercenaries in Byzantine lands, fighting in the infamous Varangian Guard. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, notes, "By the time the great heathen army landed in England, the warriors who made up its ranks were among the most experienced fighters in Europe. They had learned from every battlefield, every siege, and every campaign. The Anglo-Saxons had never faced anything like them. These men were not simple plunderers. They were seasoned warriors, skilled in siege warfare, organized battle tactics, and strategic campaigning." Most Anglo-Saxon armies at the time consisted of local militias, known as the fyrd, farmers and landowners who were called up in times of war. They were not professional soldiers. By contrast, the Viking warriors of the great heathen army had spent their entire lives fighting. This disparity in training, organization, and experience would prove catastrophic for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Historians have debated the true motivations behind the great heathen army's invasion. Unlike the typical Viking raids of earlier decades, this was not a simple quest for silver and slaves. The great heathen army came to seize land, establish rule, and dismantle the existing Anglo-Saxon order. Peter Sawyer in the Viking Expansion outlines 3 key reasons why the invasion occurred. 1. The promise of land and power. Scandinavia, particularly Denmark and Norway, was experiencing political turmoil in the mid-9th century. Ambitious warlords and younger sons of noble families saw England as a land of opportunity, a place where they could carve out their own kingdoms. Rather than returning home to fight for scraps, many Viking leaders sought to conquer new lands and establish their own rule. The weakened state of Anglo-Saxon England. By the 860s, England was divided into 4 main kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia. These kingdoms were constantly at war with one another, creating a perfect opportunity for an invading force to exploit their rivalries. Unlike the Franks, who had begun to fortify their cities and coasts, the Anglo-Saxons were still unprepared for sustained Viking aggression. The legacy of Ragnar Lothbrok, as told in the sagas, Norse sagas, written centuries later, claim that the great heathen army invaded to avenge the legendary Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok, who had supposedly been captured and executed by King Ella of Northumbria. This story, though likely a later embellishment, reflects the Norse cultural emphasis on vengeance and honor. Even if the tale of Ragnar's execution was invented, the idea that Viking leaders sought to punish the Anglo-Saxons and claim England as their own was very real. Gareth Williams in Viking Britain adds, whether or not the great heathen army truly came for revenge, their actions were the same. They sought to dismantle the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and reshape England in their own image. After landing in East Anglia, the Vikings didn't immediately begin their conquest. Instead, they did something unexpected. They negotiated. King Edmund of East Anglia, realizing he was outnumbered, chose to supply the Vikings with horses instead of fighting them. This decision allowed the great heathen army to become fully mobile, enabling them to launch rapid campaigns across England. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, describes this turning point. It was a fateful mistake. By granting the Vikings access to the greatest weapon of the Anglo-Saxon nobility, the horse, King Edmund had sealed England's fate. What had once been an army of sea-borne raiders became a cavalry force capable of devastating entire kingdoms. With horses, experienced leadership, and a divided enemy, the great heathen army was poised to reshape England forever. Their next target? Northumbria and the great city of York. The great heathen army was not a disorganized mass of warriors, nor was it a single unified force. It was a coalition of warbands, a gathering of powerful Viking leaders who had carved out their reputations across the battlefields of Europe. Each of these leaders had their own ambitions, their own rivalries, and their own visions of conquest. Unlike previous Viking raids, where chieftains led independent warbands for quick profit, the great heathen army was led by a council of warlords, some of whom would go on to shape the future of England itself. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, writes, "The leaders of the great heathen army were not mere raiders. They were kings in the making, warriors who had outgrown the small-scale ambitions of their predecessors. They saw England not just as a prize, but as a land to rule." To understand the unprecedented success of the Viking invasion, we must first understand the men who led it. If there was one name that terrified the Anglo-Saxons more than any other in the late 9th century, it was Ivar the Boneless. His legend is shrouded in mystery, but all sources, both Norse and Anglo-Saxon, agree on one thing: he was a strategist without equal. The enigma of his name. What did boneless mean? Historians have long debated the meaning of Ivar's epithet, boneless, hinbeinlausi in Old Norse. Medical condition theory. Some scholars believe Ivar may have suffered from a genetic disorder, such as osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease, or another condition that made him physically weak. Serpent imagery theory. Others suggest that boneless was a symbolic title, possibly referring to his serpent-like movements in battle or his ability to slip through enemy lines unseen. Fear and propaganda theory. Another theory is that the title was a psychological weapon, a deliberate choice to strike fear into enemies, much like Viking war banners depicting monstrous beasts. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, argues that Ivar the Boneless is one of the most elusive figures of the Viking Age. Whether his condition was physical or metaphorical, he was undeniably a man of immense intelligence and ambition. Despite the mystery surrounding his name, one thing is clear: Ivar was a military genius. Unlike other Viking warlords who relied on brute force, Ivar used strategy, deception, and psychological terror. He was known for luring enemies into traps, forcing them into narrow passages or marshy terrain where their numbers meant nothing. He spread fear before battle, using fire, brutality, and calculated intimidation to break enemy morale before the first sword was drawn. He was patient, choosing his battles carefully rather than fighting for the sake of glory. Peter Sawyer in the Viking Expansion describes Ivar's methods. Where others saw war as a contest of strength, Ivar saw it as a game of the mind. His victories were often won before the battle even began. But Ivar was not the only leader of the great heathen army. Beside him stood warriors just as dangerous in their own ways. If Ivar was the strategist, his brother Halfdan was the conqueror. Unlike Ivar, who preferred tactics and patience, Halfdan was a warrior through and through, a man who thrived in the chaos of battle. He led the direct assaults on Anglo-Saxon strongholds, leading from the front rather than the shadows. He was one of the first Viking rulers of Northumbria, seizing control of York and establishing a permanent Viking presence in the north. He was ambitious, aiming not just to raid but to rule. Gareth Williams in Viking Britain describes Halfdan's impact. Where Ivar was careful, Halfdan was relentless. He understood that the key to Viking rule in England was not just plundering it, but controlling it. Halfdan's brutality and ambition would make him one of the first true Viking kings of England. Ubba was another brother of Ivar, though he is often overshadowed by his more famous siblings. However, contemporary sources suggest that he was one of the most feared Viking warlords of the invasion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions him specifically as a great Viking leader, suggesting that even among the Norse he stood out. He played a major role in the invasion of Wessex, leading Viking armies in battles against Alfred the Great. He was known for his ferocity in battle, embodying the warrior spirit that the Vikings idolized. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, describes Ubba as a leader whose strength lay in his ability to inspire fear. Where he led, men followed, not because of loyalty, but because of terror. Ubba's fate would be sealed in the wars against Wessex, but before his end, he would strike at the heart of Anglo-Saxon resistance. While Guthrum was not one of the original leaders of the great heathen army, he rose to power as one of its most significant commanders. Unlike Ivar, Halfdan, or Ubba, Guthrum was a long-term strategist, focusing not just on battles, but on the governance of Viking-controlled lands. He would go on to lead the last great push against Wessex, bringing the Anglo-Saxon world to its knees. His later defeat by Alfred the Great at the Battle of Edington would mark the turning point in the Viking Wars in England. Peter Sawyer in the Viking Expansion describes Guthrum as a warlord with the mind of a king. He was not content with conquest, he wanted to rule. Guthrum's legacy would extend beyond the battlefield, shaping the Danelaw and the integration of Viking rule in England. The leaders of the great heathen army were not ordinary Vikings. They were men of vision, ambition, and terrifying skill in warfare. Ivar the Boneless was the strategist, the master of deception. Halfdan was the conqueror, the first Viking king of Northumbria. Ubba was the warrior, feared by both Viking and Anglo-Saxon alike. Guthrum was the ruler, the man who sought to hold what others had won. Together, these men rewrote the history of England, setting the stage for the wars that would define the next century. The arrival of the great heathen army in 865 AD did not immediately lead to a devastating war. Instead, its first campaign was almost bloodless, a sign that the Anglo-Saxon rulers were woefully unprepared for what was to come. As the Viking force landed on the shores of East Anglia, its leaders, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, faced little resistance. The kingdom's ruler, King Edmund of East Anglia, was no fool. He had seen what the Vikings had done to other regions of England, and he knew that his forces were too weak to oppose them in open battle. Rather than risk complete destruction, Edmund chose diplomacy over war. He offered the Vikings horses, supplies, and treasure in exchange for peace. For the time being, Ivar and his warlords accepted the offer. But the Vikings had no intention of staying in East Anglia. Their real target lay to the north, where the kingdom of Northumbria was in the middle of a bloody civil war. Gareth Williams, in Viking Britain, describes this moment. King Edmund's decision to submit without a fight may have spared East Anglia from immediate destruction, but it also set a dangerous precedent. The Vikings now knew that the Anglo-Saxon rulers could be cowed, that their kingdoms were divided, and that fear was as effective a weapon as the sword. With fresh horses and a well-fed army, the great heathen army turned toward Northumbria, where a fractured kingdom awaited its doom. Of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria should have been the hardest to conquer. It was one of the largest and most powerful realms in England, home to the famous city of York, Jorvik. But in 866 AD, when the great heathen army arrived at its gates, Northumbria was already tearing itself apart. A brutal civil war had erupted between two rival kings, Ella and Osbert, both of whom claimed the throne. Their armies were locked in battle, their nobles divided. It was the perfect opportunity for the Vikings to strike. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, explains, "The Northumbrians, blinded by their own internal conflicts, failed to see the true danger that approached from the south. The Vikings were not just another faction in their civil war, they were an existential threat." In autumn of 866, Ivar and Halfdan marched north with their army, advancing rapidly with their new East Anglian horses. They arrived at the gates of York before the Northumbrians could react, taking the city almost unopposed. For 5 months, the Vikings fortified their hold over York, preparing for the inevitable counterattack. In March 867, Kings Ella and Osbert finally realized the danger they faced. They set aside their differences and led a combined force against the Vikings, hoping to retake their city. It was a disaster. The Northumbrians attacked head-on, trying to force their way into York. But Ivar, a master of tactics, had anticipated their move. He allowed them to push into the city's narrow streets, only to trap them inside, cutting off their retreat. The Northumbrian army was slaughtered and both kings were killed in the battle. But Ella's death was no ordinary battlefield casualty. According to Norse sagas, Ivar had a personal reason for wanting him dead. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok claims that Ella had once captured and executed Ivar's father, Ragnar Lothbrok, by throwing him into a pit of snakes. Now, Ivar took his revenge, the Blood Eagle. According to Norse tradition, Ivar ordered that Ella be executed by Blood Eagle, a horrifying method of execution in which the victim's ribs were cut open from the back and pulled outward like wings, while their lungs were ripped out of their body. Whether this actually happened is debated by historians, as the only sources for it come from later medieval sagas. However, what is undeniable is that Northumbria fell that day. The kingdom was now under Viking control, and York became the first major Viking stronghold in England. Timothy Bolton in The Empire of Canute the Great writes, "With the capture of York, the great heathen army had done what no Viking force before them had achieved. They had taken an entire Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and they were only getting started." With Northumbria crushed, the great heathen army turned its sights southward. The next major kingdom in their path was Mercia, the second largest Anglo-Saxon realm after Wessex. In 868 AD, the Vikings advanced into Mercia, seizing control of Nottingham. King Burgred of Mercia, desperate for help, called upon King Ethelred of Wessex and his brother Alfred, later Alfred the Great, to intervene. The combined Mercian and Wessex forces marched on Nottingham, but instead of fighting, Burgred chose to negotiate peace, paying the Vikings a large tribute to leave Mercia alone. This bought time, but it did not stop the Viking advance. Instead, the great heathen army now turned its wrath toward the kingdom that had humiliated them in 865, East Anglia. In 869 AD, the Vikings returned to East Anglia, where King Edmund now refused to submit. The East Anglian army attempted to resist, but they were swiftly crushed. Edmund himself was captured, and his fate became one of the most famous martyrdom stories in English history. According to later accounts, Edmund was tied to a tree, shot with arrows until his body was pierced like a porcupine, then beheaded. His severed head was said to have been guarded by a wolf, leading to the later legend of Saint Edmund, the patron saint of England. Eleanor Parker in Dragonlords explains, "The execution of Edmund was meant to send a message. This was not a simple raid. This was a conquest. The old kings would either bow to the Norse or they would die." By the dawn of 870 AD, the great heathen army had annihilated two Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria was under Viking rule, with York as their capital. East Anglia had been crushed, its king executed in brutal fashion. Mercia had submitted, paying tribute rather than fighting. Only one kingdom remained truly free: Wessex. The war for England was now a war for survival, and the fate of the Anglo-Saxon world rested in the hands of one young leader, Alfred of Wessex. By the beginning of 871 AD, the great heathen army had achieved what no Viking force had done before. In just 5 years, they had dismantled the political order of Anglo-Saxon England. Northumbria had fallen. York was now a Viking city. East Anglia had been crushed, its king Edmund brutally executed. Mercia had been weakened and forced to submit, its king choosing to pay tribute rather than resist. The only kingdom left standing was Wessex, the ancestral homeland of the West Saxons. Unlike the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex was wealthier, better organized, and had a stronger military tradition. Its rulers had been watching the Viking conquest unfold with growing unease. But now the storm had reached their borders. The final test of the Anglo-Saxons had begun. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, writes, "By 871, it was clear that the Viking warlords intended to take all of England, but they had not yet faced Wessex, and Wessex would prove to be their greatest challenge." The king of Wessex at this time was Ethelred, a capable but beleaguered ruler, constantly forced to defend his land against the relentless Viking onslaught. At his side stood his younger brother, Alfred, a warrior scholar who would later be remembered as Alfred the Great. The war that followed would define the future of England. The Vikings did not wait long to strike. In January 871, they launched a full-scale invasion of Wessex, hoping to eliminate the last remaining Anglo-Saxon stronghold. What followed was one of the most brutal years in English history, the Year of 9 Battles. The first major clash came at Reading, where the great heathen army, now reinforced by fresh warriors from across the North Sea, established a stronghold. King Ethelred and Prince Alfred marched toward Reading, determined to drive the invaders back, but when they attacked, they were met with a devastating counter-offensive. The Vikings had fortified their position, turning the town into an improvised fortress. The Anglo-Saxons were unable to break through the defensive lines, suffering heavy casualties. Ethelred and Alfred were forced to retreat, leaving the Vikings in control of the battlefield. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, notes, The Battle of Reading was a harsh lesson for Wessex. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were organized, disciplined, and fully capable of holding territory. After the defeat at Reading, it seemed as if Wessex would fall like the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But just days later, the tide of war changed. The Battle of Ashdown, 8th January 871 AD, a moment of hope. 4 days after the defeat at Reading, the Anglo-Saxons regrouped. King Ethelred and Alfred mustered a second army and confronted the Vikings at Ashdown, a wind-swept ridge in the Berkshire Downs. According to later sources, as the battle began, King Ethelred refused to leave his tent, insisting on finishing his prayers before taking command. This left Alfred to lead the army alone. Rather than waiting, Alfred took a bold gamble. He ordered an immediate attack, leading his warriors into battle before his brother had even joined them. The West Saxons charged uphill, smashing into the Viking shield wall. Alfred's warriors fought with desperate ferocity, determined to avenge their earlier defeat. After hours of brutal combat, the Viking lines began to waver, and finally they broke and fled. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records this as a decisive victory, stating, "The heathens were put to flight and we held the field." Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, describes Ashdown as a turning point in the war. For the first time, the West Saxons proved that the Vikings were not invincible, but one victory would not be enough. Despite the triumph at Ashdown, Wessex's struggles were far from over. Over the next few months, the Vikings launched relentless counterattacks, and the Anglo-Saxons suffered devastating losses. In March 871, the Battle of Miriton ended in another crushing Viking victory. King Ethelred was mortally wounded, leaving Wessex without a strong leader. Alfred, still in his early 20s, was suddenly thrust into the kingship of a nation on the verge of collapse. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, writes, "Alfred's ascension came at the worst possible moment. He inherited a kingdom that was exhausted, leaderless, and teetering on the brink of annihilation. For the next 4 years, from 871 to 875, the war dragged on. The Vikings continued to ravage the countryside, burning towns and monasteries. Alfred struggled to keep his forces together, often resorting to guerrilla tactics to harass the enemy. The Anglo-Saxons faced constant famine and hardship as Viking warbands plundered their food supplies. The worst moment came in 875 AD, when the Viking warlord Guthrum led a massive army into Wessex, determined to finish what Ivar and Halfdan had started. In January 878, Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack on Chippenham, forcing King Alfred into hiding. Alfred fled to the marshlands of Athelney, where he gathered a small force of loyal warriors. At this point, most rulers would have surrendered, but Alfred refused to yield. Instead, he did something no Anglo-Saxon king had ever done before. He disappeared into the marshlands, preparing for one final stand. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, explains, "This was the lowest point for Wessex. Alfred, once a prince of a proud kingdom, was now reduced to a fugitive, living in the swamps. Yet from these swamps he would begin the fight back that saved England." In the winter of 875 AD, Alfred and a small band of loyal followers retreated into the swampy wilderness of Athelney, a remote and inhospitable region of Somerset. From here, he began a campaign of resistance, launching surprise attacks against Viking garrisons and supply lines. This period became legendary in English history, giving rise to the famous tale of Alfred and the burnt cakes, a story in which a disguised Alfred, hiding among peasants, was scolded by a woman for failing to watch over her baking bread. But behind the legend was a real strategy. Alfred rallied the remaining forces of Wessex, using the marshlands as a defensive stronghold. He built alliances with local lords, strengthening his army. He carefully planned one final battle, a last stand that would decide England's fate. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, writes, Alfred's time in the marshes was not just about survival. It was about transformation. The young prince who had fought at Ashdown would emerge from Athelney as a warrior king, and in 878 AD, that warrior king would march to war for the last time. Wessex had survived when all other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen. Alfred, once a mere prince, had now become the last hope of England. The Vikings had pushed Wessex to the brink of extinction, but they had failed to finish the job. The final battle was coming, and at Edington, Alfred the Great would change the course of history forever. Eleanor Parker, in Dragonlords, The History and Legends of Viking England, describes this moment as a time of absolute darkness for the Anglo-Saxons. Every kingdom of England had fallen, and now their last king was little more than a fugitive in the swamps. For the first time in history, it seemed as though England would belong to the Norse. But Alfred had not fled to surrender. He had fled to survive. From the swamps of Athelney, he began to fight back. He gathered the last remnants of his army, calling upon those who still remained loyal to Wessex. He launched guerrilla raids against Viking outposts, striking swiftly and disappearing into the marshes. He reorganized his forces, training them in new tactics that would counter the Viking shield wall. Most importantly, he spread a message of hope. He sent word throughout Wessex that the king was alive, that he had not abandoned his people, and that the fight was not yet over. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, writes, The genius of Alfred was not just in his ability to survive, but in his ability to inspire. He turned a moment of absolute defeat into a rallying cry, transforming himself from a fugitive into a symbol of resistance. The time to strike back was coming. By the spring of 878 AD, Alfred had gathered a small but determined army. Unlike the fractured forces that had been so easily crushed at Chippenham, these warriors were battle-hardened survivors, men who had lost everything to the Vikings and had nothing left to lose. In May 878, Alfred marched out of Athelney. He moved toward the Viking-occupied lands, spreading word that the Saxons would make one last stand. His army swelled as farmers, exiles and warriors joined him, drawn by his vision of resistance. Eleanor Parker in Dragonlords describes this moment as Alfred had become something more than a king. He had become a legend, the last hope of the Anglo-Saxon world, the man who would either reclaim his kingdom or die in the attempt. The final battle was coming. The battlefield would be Edington, and if Alfred failed here, Wessex would cease to exist. Guthrum had brought Wessex to the brink of destruction, but Alfred had survived. The Viking conquest of England was nearly complete, but one last obstacle remained. In May 878, the two armies would meet in one of the most decisive battles in English history. The war was about to be decided, and at Edington, Alfred the Great would determine the fate of England. By the spring of 878 AD, Alfred the Great had emerged from the marshes of Athelney, no longer a fugitive, but a king reborn. After months of retreat and guerrilla warfare, he had rallied the shattered remnants of Wessex, forging them into an army of survivors, men who had lost their homes, their families, but not their will to fight. His opponent Guthrum had no reason to believe that Wessex posed any further threat. His forces had spent months occupying much of the kingdom, raiding its lands and subjugating its people. He had crushed Alfred once, and he saw no reason why this would not happen again. But Guthrum had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated Alfred's ability to turn desperation into strength. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Canute the Great, writes, Alfred's genius was not just in his ability to survive, but in his understanding of time. He knew when to retreat, when to wait, and when to strike, and now the moment had come. Riding out from Athelney, Alfred called upon the remaining noblemen of Wessex to gather at Egbert's Stone, a meeting point deep in the countryside. Messengers were sent across the land, spreading word that the king had returned. It was a desperate call to arms, and thousands answered. Farmers and villagers who had seen their homes burned took up spears and axes. Noble warriors who had lost everything returned to fight for their land. The surviving elements of the Wessex Fyrd came together for one final battle. By early May 878, Alfred had assembled a force large enough to challenge Guthrum. The time had come for the final reckoning. The clash between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings took place at Edington, a strategically vital location. The battlefield was chosen carefully by Alfred, positioned on high ground, giving the West Saxons a natural advantage. The Viking army, seasoned and confident, formed a traditional shield wall, the unbreakable formation that had won them countless battles. Alfred's army, less experienced but more determined, prepared to smash against the Viking line in what would be the most crucial battle of their lives. Peter Sawyer in the Viking Expansion describes the scene. The Battle of Edington was not just another Viking raid or another Anglo-Saxon skirmish. It was a moment upon which the future of England depended. If Alfred failed, there would be no more kings of Wessex, only Viking overlords. Alfred knew that defeating the Viking shield wall would not be easy. The Norse warriors were disciplined, skilled in close combat and accustomed to victory. If the West Saxons failed to break them, the battle and England would be lost. As the battle began, Alfred did something bold and unconventional. Instead of immediately throwing his entire army forward, he ordered his men to advance slowly and deliberately. Unlike in previous battles, where the Anglo-Saxons had often rushed into combat only to be outmaneuvered, this time they moved forward as a single, solid mass. They matched the Vikings, shield for shield, refusing to be drawn into the chaotic individual fighting that the Norse excelled at. The two lines collided with an earth-shaking force, the sound of clashing iron and battle cries echoing across the field. For hours, the battle raged in a brutal deadlock. The shield walls ground against each other like two immovable forces. Warriors fought hand to hand, hacking and stabbing over their shields. The air was thick with blood and the desperate cries of dying men. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, describes the horror of such a battle. The shield wall was a brutal, suffocating place. Men were packed so tightly that the fallen couldn't fall. They remained upright, pinned by the bodies of their comrades. It was a test of endurance as much as skill. At first, it seemed as if the Vikings would hold, their battle-hardened warriors weathering the storm. But then something changed. After what must have felt like an eternity, Alfred ordered a full-force charge. The West Saxons pushed forward with everything they had, driving against the Viking shield wall. The long battle had exhausted the Norsemen, many of whom had fought in countless previous campaigns. Alfred's tactics, combined with the desperate determination of his men, began to break through the enemy ranks. Slowly, the Viking wall began to buckle. The shield formations started to falter, gaps appearing in their once impenetrable defence. Guthrum, realizing that his army was on the verge of collapse, tried to rally his warriors, but the West Saxons pressed harder. The Vikings began to retreat, falling back toward their stronghold. The Anglo-Saxons surged forward, cutting them down as they fled. What had begun as a battle of survival had now turned into a decisive victory for Wessex. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, writes, "For the first time in years, the Vikings were not the ones dictating the terms of battle. They were not the unstoppable force. They were the ones running." By the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with the dead. The West Saxons had won, but Alfred knew that the war was not over yet. The surviving Vikings retreated to their fortress, hoping to hold out for reinforcements. But Alfred was relentless. He surrounded the stronghold, cutting off supplies and escape routes. The siege lasted for 2 weeks, with the Vikings trapped inside. Finally, starving and exhausted, Guthrum was forced to surrender. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, describes Guthrum's surrender as the moment the Viking tide was finally checked. Guthrum, who had once seemed invincible, now stood before Alfred, not as a conqueror but as a man defeated. But Alfred did not execute Guthrum. Instead, he did something unexpected. He offered terms of peace, on the condition that Guthrum convert to Christianity. The Viking warlord, recognizing that he had no other option, agreed. In a symbolic act of submission, Guthrum was baptized, taking the Christian name Ethelstan. The war was over, for now. The Battle of Edington was not just a victory, it was a moment that saved Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred had done what no other English ruler had done before. He had decisively defeated the Viking invaders. Guthrum's surrender marked the beginning of a new era, the establishment of the Danelaw and the survival of Wessex as an independent kingdom. But the Viking threat was not gone. Alfred had won a battle, but the war for England's future was far from over. Under the Treaty of Wedmore, the Vikings and Saxons divided England. The north and east became Danelaw, ruled by Viking law. The south remained under Anglo-Saxon control. Gareth Williams, in Viking Britain, writes, "The Treaty of Wedmore was not a Viking defeat. It was a Viking foothold. The north was now theirs. The Vikings had not just come to raid, they had come to rule." The Battle of Edington in May 878 AD was more than just a military engagement. It was the moment when the fate of Anglo-Saxon England was rewritten. Alfred the Great had led the West Saxons to victory, proving that the Viking advance was not unstoppable. But victory on the battlefield did not mean an end to the war. The great heathen army had been crippled, but not annihilated. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, describes the situation. By the summer of 878, the great heathen army was no longer an army. It was a broken remnant of its former self, isolated and desperate. Alfred had not just won a battle, he had outlasted an empire. With no other choice, Guthrum surrendered, but what happened next was unexpected. Instead of executing Guthrum and his remaining warriors, a fate that many expected, Alfred offered them peace. But it was a peace on his terms. Guthrum and his followers had to leave Wessex and never return. They had to formally recognize Alfred as the superior ruler. Guthrum had to convert to Christianity and accept baptism. This final condition was the most symbolic of all. Viking warriors were pagans, dedicated to the old gods of Odin and Thor. To force their leader to submit to Christian baptism was a humiliating but politically brilliant move by Alfred. Gareth Williams, in Viking Britain, an exploration, explains the baptism of Guthrum was not just about religion, it was about submission. It was a psychological victory for Alfred, a statement that he had not only defeated his enemies, but had forced them to acknowledge the legitimacy of his rule. On Whit Sunday, 878 AD, in a quiet ceremony at Alla, Guthrum was baptized, taking the Christian name Ethelstan. Alfred himself stood as his godfather, further cementing their new relationship. It was an act that signaled the beginning of a new order in England, an order that would lead to the creation of the Danelaw. The peace agreement between Alfred and Guthrum was not just a truce, it was a complete reorganization of England's political landscape. Over the next few years, a formal treaty was drafted, known to history as the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum. This document officially divided England into two spheres. Wessex and its allied territories remained Anglo-Saxon. The eastern and northern parts of England, now under Viking rule, became known as the Danelaw. The treaty outlined fixed borders, setting the boundary at Watling Street, a major Roman road running from London to Chester. Everything to the west of this line remained under Alfred's rule. Everything to the east became the domain of the Danes. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, describes this as a remarkable political settlement, unprecedented in Viking history. It was not a tribute agreement, nor was it a temporary ceasefire. It was the recognition of a new reality. The Vikings were no longer invaders, they were now rulers. The Danelaw was born. The creation of the Danelaw was one of the most radical shifts in early medieval England. For the first time, England was divided not just by political control, but by culture, language, and law. The Danelaw was not just a Viking-occupied territory, it was a region where Norse customs, governance, and legal systems took root, permanently influencing the development of English society. Language, Norse words merged with Old English, leading to linguistic influences that persist in English today, e.g. thrift, window, knife. Law and justice. The Danelaw operated under Danish legal traditions which were distinct from those of the Anglo-Saxons. Land ownership. Viking settlers established new farming communities, with land ownership patterns differing from those in Wessex. City growth. Norse traders revitalized towns, turning places like York into thriving commercial centres. Eleanor Parker in Dragon Lords explains, the Danelaw was not just a conquered land, it was a hybrid world where Viking and Anglo-Saxon influences fused together, creating a new cultural and economic reality. Though politically divided, England was now a land of two peoples, their histories forever intertwined. One of the most striking consequences of the Danelaw was the transition of the Vikings from raiders to settlers. Many Viking warriors chose to remain in England rather than return to Scandinavia. They took Anglo-Saxon wives, raising children who were neither fully Viking nor fully English. Large numbers of Danish farmers and craftsmen migrated to the Danelaw, seeking fertile land and new opportunities. This shift from warrior culture to agrarian society mirrored similar transformations in Viking-controlled lands in Ireland, Scotland, and Normandy. The Vikings were not just plunderers, they were pragmatic rulers who knew how to adapt to new realities. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, observes, the creation of the Danelaw was a defining moment in Viking history. It was proof that the Norse were not just destroyers, they were also builders. They had come to England as conquerors, but many stayed as landowners and lords. This period also saw an increase in trade as Viking merchants established networks that linked England with Scandinavia, the Frankish Empire, and beyond. The cultural and economic integration of the Danelaw into the wider medieval world had begun. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum had brought an end to one chapter of the Viking Wars, but it did not end the Viking presence in England. The Danelaw was a compromise, not a final resolution. Alfred had saved Wessex, but England remained divided. The Vikings had gained a kingdom, but they had lost their unchallenged dominance. The Anglo-Saxons and the Norse would now coexist, but tensions would remain. Would the Danelaw survive in the long term? Or was it merely a pause in the larger struggle for control of England? Only time would tell. What would drive a king to murder his own mercenaries, to burn civilians alive in a church? On St. Brice's Day, November 13th, in the year 1002, King Ethelred II of England ordered the killing of Danes living within his kingdom. What followed was a massacre, but was it justice or panic? Modern archaeology and ancient charters reveal a story of fear, betrayal, and political desperation that may have changed the fate of England forever. The massacre did not occur in a vacuum. In the final decades of the 10th century, Anglo-Danish relations were deteriorating rapidly. Danish raids had resumed with intensity, and between 997 and 1001, Viking warbands laid waste to towns along the southern coast. The Battle of Maldon in 991, a catastrophic defeat for the English, symbolized the helplessness of Ethelred's forces. In response, the king resorted to paying Danegeld, a tribute to dissuade further attacks, an act perceived by many as weakness. The historian Barbara York, an expert in early medieval England, contextualizes this fear bluntly. It was the type of hard-hitting reply that was necessary in a world inhabited by Vikings. Yet not all Danes in England were raiders. Many were settlers, merchants and farmers who had intermarried and assimilated in regions such as Wessex. Others were mercenaries, hired by Ethelred himself to protect the realm, some of whom had turned on him. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Ethelred was informed that a conspiracy was forming among the Danes. They would beshrew him of his life, and afterwards all his counsel, and then have his kingdom without resistance. In response, Ethelred issued a royal decree that all Danes living in England, those who had sprung up in this island, were to be killed. His 1004th charter, issued 2 years after the massacre, described this as a most just extermination. He likened the Danes to cockle among the wheat, suggesting a corrupting presence that had to be purged. Simon Keynes, former professor of Anglo-Saxon at Cambridge, argues that this act, while extreme, reflected a population traumatized by betrayal. This was a reaction of a people who had suffered under repeated Danish attacks through mercenaries who had turned on their employers. It was not, he insists, a policy of ethnic genocide, but a desperate military decision. One of the most well-documented instances of the killings occurred in Oxford. Danes living in the town, realizing what was about to unfold, sought sanctuary in St. Fridswide's church. But the townspeople, unable to remove them, burned the church to the ground. Ethelred's charter records this event with chilling clarity. Those Danes entered this sanctuary of Christ, but when all the people in pursuit strove to drive them out and could not, they set fire to the planks and burnt, as it seems, this church with its ornaments and its books. In 2008, archaeologists excavating the grounds of St. John's College, Oxford, discovered a mass grave. The remains of 37 young males, most between 16 and 25 years of age, bore signs of a frenzied attack. Axe wounds to the back, skulls crushed from behind, and charring on the bones. There were no defensive wounds. They had been unarmed. Chemical analysis suggested that the victims were Viking in origin, and DNA linked at least one of them to Otterup in Denmark. These were not raiders in the act. They were running. The massacre was not isolated to Oxford. At Ridgeway Hill, near Weymouth, archaeologists uncovered 54 beheaded Scandinavian males buried in a mass grave, dated to around the same period, though it is uncertain whether this was also part of the St. Brace's Day killings. The similarity in violence and dating is striking, and yet the Danelaw regions of England, with a long-standing Danish presence, remained largely calm. This, combined with charters and land grants Ethelred later made to Danes, leads many scholars to conclude that the massacre was localized, targeting military-aged men in areas where threats of treachery were highest. Historian Levi Roche, in his biography of Ethelred, warns against viewing the massacre as strategic genius. These purges bred suspicion and division at a critical moment, and in the end, Ethelred's death was soon followed by the conquest of England by the Danish ruler Canute. Among the dead, historical accounts claim, was Gunhilda, the sister of King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, and her husband Palig Tokkesen, a former ally of Ethelred. Whether this is true or apocryphal, the Danish response was real. Svein invaded England in 1003, ravaging southern towns with renewed fury. Ethelred's power dwindled rapidly. By 1013, Svein forced Ethelred into exile. By 1016, Swein's son, Canute the Great, was crowned King of England. The massacre intended to secure Ethelred's kingdom may have accelerated its collapse. Historians remain divided. Some view Ethelred's order as reckless and destabilizing, while others consider it a grim but calculated move given the circumstances. Ian Howard and Barbara York both suggest the killings were responses to mercenary betrayal, not an attempt at ethnic cleansing. The massacre was committed in response to the treachery of Ethelred's mercenary army, writes Howard. In contrast, Roche and Anne Williams stress the long-term damage it caused, both politically and morally. Williams writes, "The The decree was not aimed at the English of Scandinavian descent living in the eastern shires, but it sowed the seeds of division Ethelred could not control. Even Simon Keynes, sympathetic to Ethelred's plight, concedes, "The events of St. Brice's Day are a stark reminder of how fear and power can shape the darkest chapters of a kingdom's story." The St. Brice's Day massacre remains one of the most haunting episodes of Anglo-Saxon England, not only for the violence it unleashed, but for what it reveals about leadership in a time of fear. It was an act of state-sanctioned brutality, not unlike those found throughout human history. A king overwhelmed by foreign invasion, internal betrayal, and mounting anxiety, lashed out. He succeeded only in inviting more bloodshed and in paving the way for a foreign ruler to claim his throne. The Viking Age in England did not end with the creation of the Danelaw. Though Alfred the Great had secured a fragile peace, the desire for total Norse control of England had not faded. The Danelaw remained Viking in culture and governance, but the rest of England remained under Anglo-Saxon rule, led by the kings of Wessex. For over a century, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Danelaw's Viking rulers had assimilated into English society, intermarrying with Anglo-Saxon nobility, yet the dream of a united North Sea empire, one where England, Denmark and Norway would be ruled by a single Norse king, persisted. In 1013 AD, that ambition was reignited when the Danish king Svein Forkbeard launched a full-scale invasion of England. Unlike the great heathen army of the 9th century, which had sought to carve out Viking settlements, Svein's goal was clear. He intended to claim the English throne for himself. Svein's invasion was swift and devastating. He led his forces directly into the heart of England, burning towns, toppling strongholds, and forcing King Ethelred the Unready into exile. By December 1013, Svein had achieved the unthinkable. He had been declared King of England, the first Viking ruler to claim the entire country, but his reign was short-lived. Svein died suddenly in February 1014 before he could consolidate his power. His unexpected death threw the conquest into chaos. The exiled King Ethelred returned, reclaiming his throne, but in Denmark, a young prince swore to finish what his father had started. His name was Knut the Great. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, explains, Svein Forkbeard's conquest was the culmination of over a century of Viking ambition. His sudden death was a setback, but his son Knut would prove to be an even greater ruler. Knut was no ordinary prince. Raised in a warrior culture, he had spent his youth fighting alongside his father in campaigns across the North Sea. By the time he launched his invasion of England in 1015, he was already an experienced military commander, hardened by battle, and determined to succeed where his father had failed. In September 1015, Knut landed in England with a massive fleet, launching a relentless campaign of conquest. His forces marched through the country with ruthless efficiency, seizing control of major Viking strongholds in the Danelaw. By early 1016, he had defeated multiple Anglo-Saxon armies, proving that his invasion was no mere raid. It was an organized, calculated bid for power. Standing in his way was King Edmund Ironside, the son of Ethelred, who had now become the last hope for Anglo-Saxon resistance. Edmund was a fierce warrior, earning his epithet Ironside for his unwavering determination in battle. He refused to surrender England without a fight. The war between Knut and Edmund culminated in one of the most decisive battles in English history. The final clash between Edmund Ironside and Knut took place at Sandun, in what is now Essex. This was not just another battle. This was the moment when Anglo-Saxon England's fate was decided. The Anglo-Saxons fought with desperate ferocity, knowing that their entire kingdom was at stake. The Vikings, battle-hardened and strategically superior, held their ground, refusing to be pushed back. After a long and brutal struggle, Cnut's forces broke through the English lines, slaughtering thousands. Eleanor Parker in Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England, describes the battle. The fields of Asandun ran red with blood. It was not just a military defeat, it was the final collapse of the old Anglo-Saxon order. Edmund, though still alive, knew that further resistance was futile. Rather than continue the war, he agreed to a truce with Knut, dividing England between them. However, fate intervened. Just weeks later, Edmund died under mysterious circumstances, leaving Knut as the uncontested ruler of England. The Viking dream of a North Sea empire had finally been realized. Knut's rule marked a dramatic turning point in English history. Unlike previous Viking warlords who had ruled through terror and force, Knut set out to establish a lasting and stable kingdom. He did not see himself as a mere conqueror. He saw himself as the rightful king of England. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, strengthening his claim to the English throne. He rewarded both Viking and Anglo-Saxon nobles, ensuring loyalty from both sides. He embraced Christianity, presenting himself as a defender of the church rather than a pagan invader. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Knut the Great, writes, Knut understood that ruling England required more than just military dominance. He had to be a king for both Danes and Saxons, a ruler who could unite rather than divide. Knut transformed England into a central part of his vast North Sea empire, which included Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. His kingdom was one of the most powerful in Europe, stretching across the North Atlantic and controlling key trade routes. He strengthened England's economy, integrating it into a wider Viking trading network. He introduced new laws, ensuring fairness between his Anglo-Saxon and Danish subjects. He ruled with both firmness and diplomacy, maintaining stability across his realm. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, describes Knut's legacy. Knut was a Viking warrior, but he was also a king who understood the art of governance. His reign was not just about conquest, it was about creating a kingdom that could endure. Knut ruled England for nearly 20 years, bringing peace and prosperity to a land that had known only war for generations. But in 1035 AD, he died suddenly, and his empire began to unravel. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, failed to maintain his legacy, leading to infighting and division. By 1042 AD, the Anglo-Saxon royal line was restored under Edward the Confessor, ending nearly 30 years of Viking rule in England. Though the Danelaw persisted for a time, the dominance of Viking kings was over. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, reflects on Knut's reign. Knut had achieved what no Viking had done before. He had ruled England as a true king, but without his leadership, his empire crumbled. It was the last great chapter of the Viking Age in England. Though Viking rule ended, the legacy of Knut's reign endured. His influence on England's governance, law, and culture remained long after his kingdom had faded. The Viking Age in England had ended, but its mark on history was indelible. For nearly 3 centuries, the Vikings had shaped the history of England, from the first raids in 789 AD to the great invasions of the 9th and 10th centuries. The Norse had been an ever-present force, a nightmare to some, a ruling class to others. They had carved out the Danelaw, toppled Anglo-Saxon kings, and even placed their own rulers on the throne. But by the mid-11th century, the Viking world was changing. The once feared Norse warriors were no longer the same unstoppable raiders that had terrorized monasteries and kingdoms alike. The great Viking kings, Knut, Svein Forkbeard, and Olaf Tryggvason, were dead. The North Sea Empire had crumbled. England, though still bearing the scars of Viking rule, had fallen back into the hands of the Anglo-Saxon kings. Yet there was one last attempt, one final bid by the Vikings to reclaim England and restore Norse rule. That final act was led by Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking king. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Knut the Great, explains, By the mid-11th century, Viking expansion had slowed, but the dream of Norse conquest had not yet faded. Harald Hardrada's invasion of England was not just a political gamble, it was the last great roll of the dice for the Viking world. This is the story of how that final gamble ended in blood, steel, and fire at Stamford Bridge. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, was no ordinary ruler. He was a warrior who had fought across the known world, a mercenary in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire, a seasoned general, and a man who believed in his divine right to rule England. As a boy, Harald had fought at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, where his half-brother, Olaf Haraldsson, was killed. He had spent years in exile, serving as a feared commander in Byzantium, before returning to reclaim the Norwegian throne in 1046 AD. By 1066, Harald was at the height of his power, ruling Norway with an iron grip and dreaming of conquest. Harald claimed that he was the rightful ruler of England, based on an old agreement between Nut the Great and Magnus the Good. But in reality, his invasion was about glory and ambition, one last attempt to revive the Viking dominance of the past. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, describes Harald as the embodiment of the Viking warrior ideal, a man who had fought in a dozen lands, who had built his power through the sword, and who believed that fate had chosen him to be King of England. But Harald was not the only man with a claim to the English throne. In 1066, England was on the brink of chaos, and three men stood ready to fight for its crown. Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon King of England; Duke William of Normandy, a distant relative of the English royal family; Harald Hardrada, the Viking warrior king of Norway. The stage was set for the most dramatic year in English history. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada launched one of the largest Viking invasions of England in history. His fleet, numbering over 300 longships, set sail across the North Sea, carrying an army of around 10,000 Norse warriors. It was the greatest Viking force to land on English shores in over a century. Harold allied himself with Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of England's king, Harold Godwinson. The Viking army landed in northern England, ravaging the countryside as they advanced. On the 20th of September 1066, they defeated an Anglo-Saxon army at the Battle of Fulford, near York. The victory at Fulford seemed to confirm Harold's destiny. The Viking army had crushed its first real opposition. York, the old Viking stronghold of Jorvik, surrendered to him without a fight. The path to the English throne appeared wide open. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, notes, Harald Hardrada's invasion was the last great expression of Viking ambition, but it was also a reckless gamble, one that would cost him everything. Then, everything changed. Harold expected King Harold Godwinson to take weeks to respond. After all, the English king was in the south, preparing for an invasion by William of Normandy. But Harold moved faster than anyone expected. In just 5 days, Harold Godwinson and his army marched 190 miles north, covering a staggering distance in record time. On 25th September, he caught the Vikings completely off guard at Stamford Bridge. The Viking army was relaxed, unprepared for battle. Many had left their armour behind, expecting further negotiations with the English. When the Anglo-Saxon army arrived, the Norse warriors were in disarray. The battle began with a desperate Viking defence as Harold and his men scrambled to form a shield wall. In the early fighting, Harold fought like a true Viking warrior, cutting down enemy soldiers with his massive two-handed axe. But then an arrow struck his throat, killing him instantly. The fall of Harald Hardrada broke the Viking resistance. His army, leaderless and outnumbered, was slaughtered by the Anglo-Saxons. Of the 300 longships that had brought the Vikings to England, only 24 returned to Norway. The Norse army had been annihilated. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, describes Stamford Bridge as the final moment of the Viking Age, a battle that ended with the death of the last great Norse king, and with him the last serious attempt at Viking rule in England. The Viking dream of England was over. Harold Godwinson's victory at Stamford Bridge was short-lived. Just 3 weeks later, on the 14th of October, 1066, he faced William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. The English, exhausted from fighting the Vikings, were defeated by the Normans. Harold Godwinson was killed, and William became King of England. With this, the old Anglo-Saxon and Viking worlds faded, replaced by a new Norman order. Though Viking raids would continue for a few more years, the age of Norse rule in England was over. England had fallen not to the Vikings, but to the Normans, a people who, ironically, were descended from Vikings themselves. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, reflects, Stamford Bridge was the end of the old world. It was the last time a Viking army would fight for the throne of England. After 1066, the Vikings no longer shaped the fate of this land. The Viking Age in England began with a raid in 789 AD. It peaked with the Danelaw, the reign of Cnut, and the invasions of 1066. It ended with the deaths of Harold Hardrada and Harold Godwinson. After Stamford Bridge, the Viking world never again threatened England. The Norse had left their mark, but their time as conquerors was over. The Viking Age had ended. In an age where Europe bled under the boots of invaders, not all Vikings sailed west. Beyond the stormy coasts of England and the burning monasteries of Francia, a different story was unfolding, a story of ambition, of empire, and of transformation. From the frostbitten shores of Sweden, warriors carved new paths not through oceans, but through rivers. Their dragon-headed ships sliced into the unknown, chasing silver, glory, and a place in history. These were no mere raiders. They were traders, kings, and mercenaries, sworn brothers in foreign lands. They forged Kievan Russes from Slavic soil. They marched as emperor's guards in the marble courts of Byzantium. They sold fur and fire to Baghdad itself. The West remembers the raids, but this is the saga of the East. Before the Viking Age fades, before they vanish into Slavic legend and Orthodox ritual, we must journey along the Dnieper, the Volga, and into the shadows of Constantinople's walls. This is not just the story of conquests, it is the untold epic of how Norsemen shaped the fate of three great civilizations: Slavic, Islamic, and Byzantine. This is the Eastern Viking saga, and it begins where most Viking tales end. Before the name Russia echoed in the halls of power, before Orthodox cathedrals crowned the skyline of Kiev, there was a forgotten beginning. A time when Vikings, not Slavs, ruled the rivers of the East, and it all began not with empire, but with tribute. By the mid-9th century, the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe was still fluid, shaped more by landscapes than by central authority. Forests, rivers, and steppe corridors defined the rhythms of commerce and war. Into this space came the Varangians, a term used in the East to describe Norse adventurers, traders, and warriors, primarily of Swedish origin. These men were known to the Greeks as Varangoi, to the Slavs as Variagi, and to themselves as Veringjar, a word that, in Old Norse, meant those sworn by an oath. Simon Franklin, professor of Slavonic Studies at University of Cambridge, in his book The Emergence of Rus, 750 to 1200 writes, "The Rus were not merely interlopers, they became architects of a political system that would outlive their own cultural identity." By the way, let's explore shortly where the term Rus, a term foundational to the history of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, came from. The word Russes did not originally come from the Slavs themselves, but from the Norse. It likely stems from an Old Norse term meaning rowers or crew of oarsmen, and referred to Swedish Vikings who travelled the great river routes of Eastern Europe. These men were known as Rus by the Slavs, Ros by the Byzantines, and Alrus by Arab chroniclers. Long before the rise of Russia, these were the Norse adventurers who gave the land its name. The origins of this transformation lie in the river systems of Eastern Europe. The Volga, Dnieper, and Dniester were not merely natural features, they were highways, flowing from the Baltic Sea in the north toward the Islamic and Byzantine worlds in the south. It was along these routes that the early Norse settlers, later called the Rus, began to build their influence. The primary chronicle, a 12th century East Slavic compilation often attributed to the monk Nestor, recounts a key legend. In 862 AD, the local Slavic and Finnic tribes of the Novgorod region invited a Varangian chieftain named Rurik to rule over them. The chronicle states, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Though the historical accuracy of this invitation is debated, the political reality is clearer. The arrival of Scandinavian elites brought military cohesion, hierarchical governance, and commercial acumen. From their early base in Ladoga and later Novgorod, the Rus established a loose but expanding system of control over the Finno-Ugric and Slavic tribes of the north. Jonathan Shepherd is a British historian specializing in early medieval Russia, the Caucasus, and the Byzantine Empire. Regarding those events, he writes, "The Volga and Dnieper systems were not frontiers, but bridges, linking Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the Caliphates. From Ladoga, Rurik's successors pushed southward. Around 882, Oleg of Novgorod, a relative of Rurik, seized control of Kiev, a strategic stronghold on the Dnieper River. By uniting the northern Rus' lands with this key southern hub, Oleg laid the foundations of a new polity, Kievan Rus. This consolidation was more than military. Kiev allowed the Varangians to insert themselves directly into the lucrative trade networks flowing toward Constantinople and Baghdad. The city became a nodal point between three civilizations, the Norse north, the Slavic forest zones, and the imperial south. Here, Byzantine silk, Abbasid silver, and Slavic furs crossed paths. It is important to understand that this state was not centralized in the modern sense. Kievan Rus was a confederation of tribute-paying principalities, loosely bound by blood, fear, and trade. Yet, its cultural and political influence would prove lasting. Florin Curta, professor of medieval history at the University of Florida, in his book The Making of the Slaves from 2008, writes, "The Norse in the East did not merely assimilate, they redefined the meaning of rulership and territory in the Slavic world. This fusion was most visible in language and elite identity, while Norse personal names dominated in the earliest records, Rurik, Oleg, Igor. Within a generation, they began to adopt Slavic titles and customs. This process, described by scholars as cultural creolization, did not signal immediate Norse disappearance, but rather adaptation. The warrior elite maintained Scandinavian burial customs and weapons well into the 10th century, even as they married into Slavic nobility and adopted local languages. Rune stones found in Sweden further illuminate this eastward migration. Many commemorate the deaths of young men who never returned from Ostervägar, the Eastern Way. Places like Gardariki, the land of towns, appear frequently in these inscriptions, a Norse term often equated with the Slavic lands around Novgorod and Kiev. Peter Heather, professor of medieval history at King's College, London, notes, "The runestones of Sweden speak to a generation of men for whom the East was a land of opportunity and death." Economic motivations drove much of this expansion. Viking settlements in the West had been shaped by land, hunger, and raiding. In the East, it was commerce that defined Varangian activity. They moved amber, wax, honey, and most crucially, slaves downriver in exchange for silver dirhams minted in Baghdad and often found hoarded in Gotland and other parts of Scandinavia. Thomas S. Noonan, professor of history and anthropology from University of Minnesota, writes, "Rus's silver hoards are a direct record of a vast commercial engine driven by the demand of the Islamic world. Yet, it was not all trade. From the very beginning, tribute and coercion were key tools of Rus's rule. The chronicle notes that the Varangians took tribute from the Slavs and Chuds, often violently. This duality, merchant and marauder, defined their presence. The complex geography of the region also played a role. The river portage system required deep local knowledge and political negotiation. In many ways, the early Russes functioned as intermediaries, both culturally and commercially, between steppe and forest, between Christendom and Islam, between Scandinavia and Byzantium. Archaeological finds from Gniozdovo, Staraya Ladoga, and Novgorod confirm the existence of bustling trading settlements with mixed populations, combining Scandinavian, Slavic, and Finnic elements. Norse-style weapons and jewelry appear alongside Slavic ceramics and Byzantine coins. The burial grounds of these communities show both inhumation and cremation, a clear sign of overlapping traditions. By the early 10th century, the Russes had begun to establish diplomatic relations with Byzantium itself. In 911, a treaty was signed between Oleg and Emperor Leo VI. This pact secured trading privileges, legal protections, and provisions for Varangian mercenary service in the Byzantine military. The Russes' elite had become recognized actors on the world stage. Angeliki E. Liu, former professor of Byzantine history at Harvard University, notes, "The Russes emerged as a political force not merely by conquest, but by embedding themselves in the diplomatic economy of Byzantium." By the time of Prince Igor and his widow Olga, Kievan Rus had shifted from a loose Norse tribal colony into a true regional power. But the eastward journey of the Varangians was far from over. Beyond commerce, beyond conquest, lay new encounters. With Islam, with wealth unimaginable, and with a culture unlike anything seen in Scandinavia. Next, we follow the silver trails to Baghdad and explore how Norsemen from Gotland and Kiev came face to face with the Abbasid Caliphate. They came not to conquer, but to trade. Yet the impact of their presence rippled across two continents. Before the Crusades, before Marco Polo, there was another link between Europe and the Islamic world, a northern one, forged not by diplomats, but by tattooed traders from the forest of Rus. Few remember it, but behind every hoard of silver buried in Swedish soil lies a forgotten connection to Baghdad. By the early 9th century, a remarkable transformation was underway in Eurasia. While Western Europe reeled from Viking raids and fragmented polities, the Abbasid Caliphate, headquartered in Baghdad, stood as the most powerful cultural and economic force in the world. A metropolis of learning, wealth, and innovation, Baghdad was not only the political capital of Islam, but also its commercial heart, drawing in goods from China, India, East Africa, and, curiously, Northern Europe. Into this world entered the Rus, Norse-speaking traders who had by now established themselves in the riverine corridors of Eastern Europe. Their motivation was clear: silver. The Abbasid economy, unlike the gold-based systems of Byzantium or the barter-heavy structures of Northern Europe, was silver-driven. Silver dirhams, minted in Samarra and Baghdad, became the most coveted currency in the Viking world. Thomas S. Noonan notes, Islamic silver fueled the Viking Age. The dirham was not just a coin, it was a catalyst. The Volga trade route became the primary axis of this exchange, beginning near Novgorod and passing through key trading centers like Gniozdovo and Bulgar on the Middle Volga. The route connected the Baltic Sea with the Caspian Sea and, by extension, with the Abbasid world. Archaeological evidence supports the scale of this trade. Over 85,000 Islamic silver coins, many from the 9th and 10th centuries, have been discovered in Scandinavia, especially in Gotland, the Swedish island that served as a linchpin for Eastern trade. Neil Price is a professor in the Department of Archaeology and Ancient History at Uppsala University in Sweden. In his monumental work on Viking history, Children of Ash and Elm, from 2020, he wrote, "The sheer volume of dirhams found in Sweden suggests not occasional contact, but an entrenched, long-term economic relationship." But this relationship was not one of equals. The Abbasids regarded the northern peoples as barbaric but useful, suppliers of fur, amber, and above all, slaves. The Rus, for their part, had little interest in cultural assimilation. Their interest was transactional, and they were willing to trade not just goods, but human lives. The Arab geographer Ibn Khordadbeh, writing in the 9th century, notes that the Russes would travel down the Volga with furs, swords, and Slavic slaves, which they sold in Muslim markets. From Baghdad, these slaves were dispersed throughout the caliphate, serving in households, armies, and labor sectors. This economic foundation underpinned a more complex cultural contact, exemplified best by the 10th century Arab envoy Ahmad ibn Fadlan. Dispatched in 921 to 922 on a diplomatic mission from Baghdad to the Volga Bulgars, Ibn Fadlan encountered a group of Russes merchants along the river. His account, preserved in the Risala, remains the most vivid primary source we possess about the Russes from an external observer. Ibn Fadlan's observations are both fascinated and appalled. He describes the Rus as tall, strong, and physically striking. I have never seen more perfect physical specimens, tall as palm trees, with blonde hair and ruddy skin. Each man has an axe, a sword, and a knife, and never leaves them. He comments extensively on their hygiene, their religious rituals, and most famously, their funerary practices. Ibn Fadlan witnessed the ship cremation of a Russ's chieftain, a ritual involving animal sacrifice, alcohol consumption, and the death of a female slave intended to accompany her master into the afterlife. Though often sensationalized in later Western interpretations, Ibn Fadlan's testimony remains central for understanding how the Norse culture was perceived by the Islamic world. James Montgomery is Sir Thomas Adams's Professor of Arabic at University of Cambridge. Fadlan's account does not merely describe the Rus, it positions them in a moral geography suspended between barbarity and fascination. Not all encounters were peaceful. As the Rus grew wealthier and bolder, some groups abandoned the trading model in favor of direct raiding. In 913, a fleet of 500 Russes' ships sailed across the Caspian Sea and attacked the Iranian coast near Gorgan, plundering towns and enslaving inhabitants. On their return journey, however, they were ambushed by Khazar forces, allies of the Abbasids. Most were killed or enslaved in turn. A second expedition in 943 saw the Russes capture Barda, the capital of the region of Aran, modern Azerbaijan. There they remained for several months, wreaking havoc until an outbreak of dysentery forced their withdrawal. Jonathan Shepherd in The Emergence of Russes writes, "The campaigns of 913 and 943 illustrate the duality of Russes' expansion, economic penetration coupled with opportunistic violence." These violent encounters should not obscure the broader picture. Most Rus's contact with the Islamic world was economic, not military. By the late 10th century, Scandinavian presence in the Volga basin declined, coinciding with the Christianization of Kievan Rus in 988 under Vladimir the Great. As Orthodox Christianity replaced Norse paganism and Byzantine models of governance replaced tribal structures, the need for long-distance expeditions decreased. Yet the legacy of this contact endured. The silver from Baghdad not only fueled the Scandinavian economy, it helped finance state building in Eastern Europe. Kievan Rus, unlike its Western Viking contemporaries in England or Normandy, was not just a military enterprise. It was a commercial civilization forged in the intersection between Norse ambition and Islamic prosperity. Florin Kurta, in The Making of the Slavs, notes, "The Rus's connection to the Islamic world is one of the most understudied pillars of medieval globalization. By the dawn of the 11th century, the great silver caravans had begun to fade. The Abbasid Caliphate itself was in decline, and new regional powers emerged. But the memory of the Rus lingered in the dirhams buried beneath Swedish fields, in the Arab chronicles of tattooed giants, and in the Slavic cities they helped raise. In the next chapter, we follow the Varangians into Byzantium, where they would trade their axes for imperial coin and become not conquerors or merchants, but bodyguards to emperors. When the Varangians first appeared at Constantinople's gates, they came as enemies, rowers in dragon ships carrying axes and fire. A century later, they stood at those same gates as protectors, not invaders, sword-bearers to the emperor himself. How did a people once labelled as barbaroi become the elite warriors of the most sophisticated empire on earth? In the year 860, Byzantine chroniclers record a sudden, brutal attack on the outskirts of Constantinople. The Rus, under the leadership of Askold and Deer, had descended from the north, sailing down the Dnieper River, across the Black Sea, and into the imperial heartlands. Their ships, light and shallow-keeled, were optimized for rivers, but capable of navigating open water when needed. The raid shocked the empire. The Byzantine world had encountered many enemies, but the Rus were different. They were not a unified nation nor the agents of a single king. They were a confederation of armed entrepreneurs, driven by profit and reputation. Their arrival marked the beginning of a complex and often contradictory relationship between the Rus and Byzantium, one that would alternate between war and alliance, plunder and oath. The life of St. George of Amastris is 9th century Byzantine hagiography, possibly referring to the 860 raid. It states, "They came down the Dnieper River in monoxyla, swift ships carved from single tree trunks, and surrounded the city. The people of Constantinople fled in fear." This early phase was marked by aggression. The Rus's Byzantine wars of 860, 907 and 941 brought violence and fear to the empire's northern frontier. The 911 treaty, however, represented a turning point. Signed under Prince Oleg, this document regulated trade, guaranteed rights for Rus's merchants in Constantinople, and granted them legal standing under Byzantine law, a remarkable concession. Jonathan Shepherd, in his book Byzantine Foreign Policy 1000 to 1071, notes, "The treaty reveals a dual identity. These Norsemen were not only raiders and warriors, but negotiators, diplomats and intermediaries. The empire recognized them because it could not ignore them." The military relationship soon followed. By the early 10th century, Varangians began entering imperial service as mercenaries. Their reputation for loyalty, fearlessness, and martial discipline made them ideal candidates. Initially irregular auxiliaries, they evolved into an elite formation. The Varangian Guard, Tagmaton Varangon, a permanent unit of foreign-born soldiers whose sole allegiance lay with the emperor. Formally established under Emperor Basil II in the late 10th century, the Guard recruited heavily from Scandinavia, primarily Sweden, but also Denmark and Norway. The men who joined were often younger sons, exiled warriors, or those seeking wealth abroad. The Västgötalagen, a 13th century Swedish law code, even had to forbid men from claiming inheritance, while in Greece, a euphemism for Byzantine service, suggesting the mass scale of enlistment. Angeliki E. Laiu, in her book The Economic History of Byzantium, notes, "Their loyalty was not to the shifting factions of Constantinople, but to the throne itself. In a court riddled with intrigue, their foreignness was a safeguard, and in battle their ferocity made them a terror to enemies and allies alike." The Guard quickly became more than a military unit. It was a symbol of imperial reach, of wealth, and of martial discipline. The Varangians were often deployed at critical moments, not in large-scale battles, but as shock troops, rear guards, and bodyguards during coups or invasions. Their weapons were distinctive: massive axes, sometimes over a metre in length, and chainmail armour adorned with Norse symbols or dragons. Accounts describe the Varangians as tall, fair-haired, and often visibly distinct from other Byzantine units. Their discipline and theatrical appearance were not accidental. In the ritual, heavy world of Constantinople, performance and loyalty were as vital as martial prowess. Michael Sellos, 11th century Byzantine courtier and historian, writes, "They would die to the last man rather than flee, and in the hour of battle they were like a wall of iron." One of the most telling accounts comes from the Chronicle of John Skylitzes, an illustrated manuscript from the 12th century that contains some of the earliest known depictions of the Guard. In it, Varangians are seen wielding great axes and standing in formation during key moments, guarding emperors, storming fortresses and executing traitors. In times of peace, the Guard functioned as ceremonial guards at court, often guarding the Chrysotriklinos, the imperial audience chamber. When emperors died, it was often the Varangians who oversaw the transfer of power and protected the succession process. Their oath-bound loyalty was seen as incorruptible. Despite their formal allegiance to Byzantium, the Varangians retained traces of their Scandinavian identity. Some brought their own runemasters to carve commemorative stones upon their return. In Sweden, the so-called Greece runestones reference journeys to Miklagard, the Old Norse name for Constantinople. The runestone U161, now the coat of arms of Täby municipality in Sweden, bears a Byzantine cross and memorializes a man named Ulf who had served in the East. Another runestone describes Ragnvaldr, a captain of the guard, returning to Sweden and raising a stone in memory of his mother. Peter Heather notes, "The runestones are echoes of identity. They speak of glory, distance, and death. In these carvings, Constantinople was not just a city, it was a rite of passage." Over time, the Guard evolved. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, many Anglo-Saxons fled their homeland and found refuge in Constantinople. From the late 11th century onward, the Guard became increasingly Anglo-Saxon in character, with former English nobles and warriors joining its ranks. This shift did not erase the unit's foundational character, but added new layers. Both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons shared a tradition of oath-bound warrior service, and many were united by a common enemy: the Normans, whose expansion had displaced them. The Varangian Guard remained a critical force until the 13th century. It fought in the Battle of Dyrrhachium, 1081, helped suppress rebellions, and played a key role in the defense of imperial authority. However, with the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople in 1204, the Guard's importance declined. Some remnants survived in the restored empire, but their role was never the same. Yet even in decline, their image persisted. Norsemen in imperial service, wielding axes for a foreign emperor in a city of marble domes and golden icons. In the ruins of Hagia Sophia, runic inscriptions, simple carvings from anonymous Varangians, remain etched into the marble balustrades. The journey of the Varangians into Byzantium reveals a deeper truth: that the Viking world was never defined by isolation or barbarity. It was a mobile, adaptive, and outward-facing culture, capable of reshaping itself to suit the needs of empire. But as Byzantium's power waned and Kievan Rus' Christianized, the Varangians disappeared from the chronicles. Their legacy passed not into myth, but into memory, carved in stone, told in foreign tongues, and buried beneath layers of forgotten silver. Next, we turn to the afterlife of this encounter: how Varangian memory, Norse identity, and Slavic statehood evolved in the centuries after the Viking Age ended. They came to plunder, to trade, to rule, and for 2 centuries they did. But what happens to a people who win? The Varangians shaped the very foundation of Rus, guarded emperors in Byzantium, and mapped the rivers of the East in blood and silver. Then they vanished, not with a final battle or a fall, but in silence, in marriages, baptisms, and forgotten graves. This is the story of how the Vikings faded from the East, not through defeat, but through assimilation. By the early 11th century, the Viking Age had reached its zenith and its turning point. The dramatic rise of the Kievan Rus, the maturation of Byzantine diplomacy, and the consolidation of Islamic powers all contributed to a shifting political landscape. In the East, the Norsemen, who had once terrorized Constantinople and profited from Baghdad's silver, now found themselves transformed. The world that had welcomed or resisted them no longer saw them as outsiders. They had become princes, merchants, Christians, and, in the eyes of their descendants, Slavs. Jonathan Shepherd, in The Emergence of Rus, from 750 to 1200, writes, "The Viking story in the East is not one of abrupt ends or dramatic collapse. It is a narrative of diffusion, of gradual absorption, where names, practices, and memories outlived identities. The Norsemen did not vanish. They became invisible by becoming essential." The most symbolic moment of this transition occurred in 988 AD, when Prince Vladimir of Kiev embraced Christianity, aligning his state with Orthodox Byzantium. This act, often interpreted as political strategy, was also a cultural watershed. The Christianization of Rus marked the formal rejection of Norse paganism, and with it, the last vestiges of Viking distinctiveness in the region. Scandinavian burials, once elaborate affairs featuring ship interments, weapons, and ritual cremations, became rarer. Grave goods diminished. pagan symbolism gave way to crosses, icons, and church bells. Simon Franklin, in his book Writing, Society and Culture in Early Rus, described those events. Christianization did not erase the Norse presence, it recontextualized it. Conversion brought new systems of memory, chronicles, saints' lives, liturgies. The Varangians, once remembered through rune and oral poetry, now entered history through the pen of monks. The Norse elite, originally distinguished by names like Rurik, Oleg, and Igor, increasingly bore Slavic or Christian names: Vladimir, Sviatoslav, Yaroslav. Their legitimacy no longer came from Norse descent or martial prowess, but from their participation in Christian kingship, marriage alliances, and ecclesiastical patronage. Yet the memory of their origins persisted in subtle forms. In Sweden, a remarkable form of historical memory survives: the Varangian rune stones. Carved between the 10th and early 12th centuries, these stones commemorate journeys to Greece, Byzantium, Sirkland, the Islamic world, and Gardariki, Rus's lands. Most were raised by family members of those who died in foreign service. Some were erected by the men themselves upon returning home. One of the most striking is the Ed runestone U112, which reads, "Ragnvaldr had this stone raised in memory of his mother. He was in Greece, was captain of the guard." This inscription, referencing Ragnvaldr's role in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, exemplifies how personal and geopolitical histories intertwined. Neil Price furthermore notes, "These stones do not mourn defeat. They celebrate participation in a world far beyond Scandinavia, in battles, rituals, and empires. They are both eulogy and announcement. We were there." Yet these runestones also mark a threshold. The youngest belonged to the early 12th century, by which point the custom had begun to fade. The decline of runic literacy and the rise of Christianity's textual traditions shifted how memory was constructed. Oral sagas and engraved stones gave way to monastic chronicles and saints' vitae. In Byzantium, too, the Varangians began to blend into the imperial fabric. After the Norman conquest of England, many Anglo-Saxon warriors joined the Varangian Guard. Over time, the Guard itself evolved, from a Scandinavian elite to a broader Germanic-speaking unit. By the late 13th century, its distinctly Norse character was largely lost, though Icelandic annals still remembered Constantinople as Miklagardr. The question of whether the Varangians disappeared or assimilated has long occupied scholars. The answer depends on how identity is measured. If one looks for language, ritual, or burial practice, the Varangians fade quickly, but if one examines institutions, governance, and historical memory, their legacy becomes undeniable. Peter Heather, in his book Empires and Barbarians, writes, "The Rurikid dynasty, which ruled Russes for centuries, was built on Varangian foundations, yet its kings ceased to be Norse in anything but genealogy. This is not a loss. It is the success of state building, where ethnic origin gives way to political legitimacy. By the mid-11th century, the Scandinavian influx into Russes had largely ended. The routes down the Volga and Dnieper were no longer filled with Varangian traders. Instead, Russes' princes sent envoys and armies along them. The political center had shifted from Varangian raiders to Slavic Christian monarchs. What remains of the Varangians is found not in identity but in historiography, in how others wrote them into history. The primary chronicle, compiled in the early 12th century, frames the Varangians as founders. Rurik is portrayed not as a foreign conqueror, but as the chosen prince of the people, a bringer of order. Yet this retrospective view masks the messiness of cultural contact. The chronicle, written by Christian monks, smooths over the pagan past, the violence of conquest, and the contradictions of assimilation. Florin Kurta, in The Making of the Slavs, writes, "The chronicle's depiction of the Varangians is as much about 12th century identity as it is about 9th century events. In remembering them as legitimate founders, it sanctifies the existing order. Myth becomes history, conquest becomes inheritance. This transformation from outsider to founder, from pagan to proto-Christian, reflects the larger narrative of medieval state formation. The Vikings, who once stood outside Christendom's moral universe, had become part of its political architecture. By the time Ibn Battuta passed through the steppes in the 14th century, the Varangians were no longer mentioned. Their axes, once feared in Byzantium, had given way to the swords of Slavic princes and the doctrines of Orthodox monks. Yet in the stone of Sweden, the marble of Hagia Sophia, and the pages of the Chronicle, their memory endured. They did not leave ruins nor a written literature of their own, but they left behind structures, political, military, and cultural, that persisted. The end of the Viking Age in the East was not a collapse. It was a transformation, from raiders to rulers, from pagans to Orthodox Christians, from Norsemen to Slavs. The Varangians became part of the very worlds they once disrupted. In the end, their greatest conquest was not territory, but legacy. The Norsemen who entered the East came as foreigners, armed with axes, trading furs and silver, strangers to the land and the faith. But centuries later, the states they helped build would become kingdoms. Their dynasties would claim divine right. Their memory would become origin myth. How did a people who left so few written words end up shaping the political DNA of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the imperial guard of Byzantium? By the beginning of the 12th century, the Varangians as a distinct political or ethnic entity had all but disappeared from the Eastern European landscape. Their customs were absorbed, their language forgotten, and their names transformed. Yet their legacy endured, etched not in surviving communities, but in the foundations of statehood, in the architecture of memory, and in the political culture of medieval and modern Eastern Europe. Jonathan Shepherd, historian from the University of Cambridge, explains, "The Varangians stand at the intersection of memory and myth. They were not just actors in early medieval politics, but symbols shaped by chroniclers, mobilized by rulers, and claimed by nations. Their role as both real and imagined founders of Rus was politically useful and therefore historically lasting." The primary chronicle, written in the early 12th century, provides the earliest and most influential version of the Varangian legacy. According to this account, the Rus, a group of Norse origin, were invited by the Slavic tribes to bring order to their land. Rurik, the legendary chieftain, establishes rule in Novgorod, and his descendants expand south to Kiev, forming what would become Kievan Rus. While modern historians approach this narrative with caution, its enduring impact cannot be overstated. The Chronicle does not merely record history, it constructs a foundational myth, one in which foreign leadership is legitimized through invitation, order, and continuity. Simon Franklin, in previous mentioned book, Writing, Society and Culture in Early Russes, writes, "The Chronicle story of Rurik is not ethnography, it is ideology. It provides a genealogy for authority, justifying dynastic rule by embedding it in the past and by locating that past in the hands of outsiders who became insiders." The Rurikid dynasty, which ruled parts of Eastern Europe until the late 16th century, anchored its authority in this narrative. Whether or not Rurik existed as described, his symbolic presence provided a frame of legitimacy. From Vladimir the Great to Yaroslav the Wise, Rus' rulers invoked their Varangian descent not to appear foreign, but to assert a lineage of power, stability, and martial strength. The Varangian impact was not limited to origin myths. In their earliest phases, the Norse brought with them forms of military organization, legal practice, and tribute collection that would shape the institutions of the Rus' state. Early treaties with Byzantium, such as those in 907 and 911, show evidence of structured legal codes governing Rus' merchants and soldiers, suggesting a degree of internal regulation, possibly inherited from Scandinavian legal customs. These early legal traditions in turn contributed to the formulation of the Russkaya Pravda, Rus' law, one of the oldest Slavic law codes. Though the final form of the Pravda was compiled after the Varangian era, its framework reflects the legacy of a society governed by warrior princes, trade norms, and kinship alliances. Florin Kurta, historian from the University of Florida, writes, "The institutional memory of the Rus was shaped not solely by Slavic customs, but by the Varangian presence. Their practices of arbitration, property, and vengeance shaped the way law was remembered and applied." Moreover, the Varangians' relationship with Byzantium had lasting ideological consequences. Through their service as mercenaries and guards, they became symbols of loyal violence, barbarian strength harnessed for imperial order. The Varangian Guard, once composed of Norse warriors, became a metaphor for incorruptibility, invoked long after the Norse had vanished from its ranks. Angeliki E. Layu furthermore notes, the Guard was not merely functional. It was symbolic, representing loyalty beyond politics, devotion to the throne rather than the court. It was the mythology of the outsider turned enforcer, a role Byzantium found repeatedly useful. As modern nation-states began constructing their own historical narratives in the 19th century, the Varangians became a contested symbol. In Russia, the Rurikid legacy was embraced as the cornerstone of imperial identity, connecting the Romanov dynasty to a mythic past of order and sovereignty. In Ukraine, the story of Kiev's early rulers became central to a national story of independence and cultural distinction, and yet both narratives relied on the same foundational myth, that the Norse had come, ruled, and then vanished, leaving behind a people and a state transformed. Peter Heather writes, in different centuries and different regimes, the Varangians have been viewed as foreign invaders, civilizing heroes or proto-national founders. Their true historical significance lies not in what they were, but in how they were remembered. This selective memory was visible in the iconography of power. Tsarist Russia commissioned paintings of Rurik's arrival. Soviet scholars, by contrast, downplayed the Norse element, emphasizing instead the Slavic roots of Kievan Rus. In Scandinavia, the eastern journeys of the Vikings became part of national folklore, celebrated in runestones, museums, and historical reenactments. In Sweden, the Gris runestones and Cirkland stones remain among the most tangible relics of the Varangian Age. These stones, many erected in the 11th century, commemorate journeys to Byzantium and the Islamic world. Their language is Norse, but their references are global. They describe service in Miklagardr, mention commanders of the Varangian Guard, and occasionally lament the loss of sons who met death in Cirkland. Neil Price, in his monumental work Children of Ash and Elm, writes, "These inscriptions are not mere personal memorials. They are public performances of memory embedded in a landscape that the men left behind. They narrate not only death, but worldliness, declaring that even the smallest village was connected to Constantinople." Even in Constantinople itself, the Norse left their mark. In the upper galleries of Hagia Sophia, faint runic inscriptions can still be seen, scratched into the stone by anonymous Varangians. They do not record theology or politics. One simply reads, Halvdan was here. It is a stark contrast to the grandeur of the basilica, a pagan name etched quietly into Christian marble. Yet it speaks volumes. The story of the Varangians in the East ends not in conquest or destruction, but in transformation. They are among history's most successful intermediaries, founders who left no manifestos, soldiers who wrote no chronicles, kings whose names dissolved into other languages. But their impact remains in the laws of Kievan Rus, in the swords of the Byzantine emperors, in the runestones of Sweden, in the chronicles of monks, and in the contested myths of modern nations. In the final segment of our journey, we return to the rivers that shaped this world, to reflect on what the Varangians truly were. Not merely Vikings in a foreign land, but the bridge between civilizations, between paganism and Christendom, between the forest and the steppe, between Scandinavia and empire. Join us as we draw this saga to a close and explore the historical meaning of the Eastern Viking Age. The Viking Age did not end in a blaze of glory. It faded quietly along the rivers of the East. There was no last stand, no final voyage, just silence. But perhaps that is the wrong way to think about endings. What if the real legacy of the Vikings in the East is not what they destroyed, but what they connected, created, and left behind? For over 2 centuries, Norse warriors, merchants, and mercenaries journeyed along the Volga and Dnieper, from the pine forests of Scandinavia to the marble palaces of Constantinople and the minarets of Baghdad. They did not build cathedrals or empires in their own name. They did not leave written chronicles. yet their presence shaped the medieval world in fundamental ways. The Varangians, a term at once specific and evolving, acted as connectors between the Islamic caliphates and Christian empires, between forest tribes and steppe nomads, between the pagan past and the Christian future. Jonathan Shepherd writes, "To write the history of Eastern Europe without the Varangians is to omit the ferryman of its political and cultural transformation. Their ships carried more than goods. They carried institutions, identities, and the rhythms of diplomacy and violence." Historians have often asked whether the Varangians were more than middlemen, whether they imposed real political structures or merely exploited existing ones. But this binary misses the point. Their role was less about domination than intermediation. They built bridges where previously there were barriers. In Kiev and Rus, they imported a hierarchical form of rulership rooted in Norse traditions of elite leadership, fused it with Slavic kinship structures, and later submitted it to Byzantine models of kingship and Christian ethics. The result was not a transplant, but a hybrid political culture, one that endured well beyond their visible presence. The geography of the Eastern Viking Age was defined by rivers, not frontiers. These were open systems, ever-shifting, subject to seasonal rhythms and political tides. The Volga, Dniester, and Dnieper were not mere trade routes. They were corridors of culture where Slavic, Turkic, Norse, and Byzantine worlds met. At key nodes, Novgorod, Kiev, Gnezdovo, Staraya Ladoga, Varangians facilitated more than economic exchange. They enabled cultural contact. They introduced not only silver and weapons, but forms of storytelling, funeral rites, and iconography. Over time, these layered into the evolving identities of the Rus's peoples. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, notes, "The Norsemen did not bring civilization to the East, but they brought motion, and motion brought transformation. They destabilized, but they also connected." In a medieval world of slow movement and local identities, this alone was revolutionary. The Viking ships that sailed east carried amber, furs, and slaves, but they also carried possibility. A man born in Gotland could die fighting for the Byzantine emperor. A youth in Kiev could be buried with Norse weapons and a Christian cross. These lives defy neat categories, and that perhaps is the true character of the Eastern Viking experience. The silence that surrounds the final phase of the Varangian story is partly one of historiography. As Kievan Rus' adopted Orthodox Christianity and Byzantine bureaucratic forms, it no longer recorded Norse deeds or distinctions. The chronicle's narrative shifts. Pagan chieftains give way to pious princes. Genealogy replaces geography. But the memory did not vanish, it simply changed form. In Sweden, runestones tell of men who died in Cirkland or served in Greece. In Constantinople, runic graffiti carved into marble columns remain mute but eloquent. In Slavic law codes, echoes of Norse practice linger. In conceptions of Vergild, property, and kinship, Simon Franklin adds, "Historical silence is not absence, it is transformation." The Varangians disappeared from the record not because they were erased, but because they were absorbed into new categories of rulership, faith, and law. The assimilation of the Varangians into Slavic society was not erasure, it was success. They became what they had once ruled. Intermarriage, shared military campaigns, and religious conversion blurred the lines between Varangian and Slav, foreigner and founder. Peter Heather notes, "In the end, the Varangians ceased to be visible because they had succeeded. Their names changed, their gods faded, but their structures endured, in dynasties, in cities, in memories." Modern scholarship emphasizes the fluidity of identity in the medieval world. People did not see themselves in fixed ethnic categories, but in terms of allegiance, family, faith, and opportunity. The Varangians exemplify this. They were Norse by origin, Slavic by adoption, and imperial by service. Their story complicates modern nationalist historiography, which seeks neat origins and clean boundaries. The Rurikid dynasty, descended symbolically or actually from the Varangians, ruled large parts of Eastern Europe until the early modern period. Its longevity is a testament to the success of the political model the Varangians helped shape. Princely rule bound by oaths, legitimacy anchored in military power, and later sacralized through Christian kingship. Later, Russian imperial ideology would look back to the Varangians as founders, especially under the Romanovs, who styled themselves as heirs to both Kiev and Byzantium. The Varangian legacy thus extended not only through bloodlines, but through myth-making, iconography, and state ideology. Florin Curta concludes, history remembers the Varangians because states chose to remember them. They were written into the origin stories of empires, not because they were first, but because they were useful. And yet, that usefulness points to a deeper truth, their role as agents of transformation. To speak of the Eastern Viking Age is to speak of a world that defies modern categories. It was neither wholly Scandinavian nor Slavic, neither pagan nor Christian, neither empire nor tribe. It was a world in motion. The Varangians brought with them violence, ambition, and cunning, but also structure, ritual, and roots. They navigated a volatile frontier between civilizations, and in doing so, helped to create new ones. Their story is not one of conquest alone, nor of decline. It is a story of transformation, not just of peoples and powers, but of identity itself. Paul Stevenson, in his monumental work, Byzantium's Balkan Frontier, observes, "The Varangians were not the beginning of Russia, nor were they a footnote to Byzantium. They were something more elusive, a hinge, a moving part in the great machinery of medieval Eurasia. Their world was the river, and like the river, they left a path, not a monument. As we leave the rivers of the East behind, we carry with us the traces of those who rode them, forgotten names, carved stones, silver coins, and the faint impression of axes laid down for crowns." The Eastern Viking Age was never a place. It was a process, a bridge between gods and emperors, tribes and states, memory and myth. In the next and final section, we draw this journey to a close and ask, what does it mean to remember the Varangians today? They came with no flag, no empire followed in their wake, no chronicles bear their voices. And yet, the Varangians changed the world. From the pine-cloaked shores of Sweden to the palaces of Constantinople and the markets of Baghdad, they moved not as conquerors but as connectors. They did not leave kingdoms behind. They left roots, institutions, and myths. They passed through Slavic forests, Byzantine courts, and Islamic cities, never fully belonging but always shaping. Their story is not just one of raids and riches. It is the story of what lies between war and diplomacy, between paganism and Christianity, between the tribal and the imperial. It is a story that reminds us that history is rarely made by permanence, but by movement. The Eastern Viking Age did not end. It was absorbed. Its people faded not in defeat, but in legacy. And even today, their shadow lingers, in coins unearthed in Gotland, in runes etched into Hagia Sophia's stone, and in the stories we tell about who we are and where we come from. If this journey through the Eastern Viking world gave you a new perspective on history, subscribe for more stories that cross borders and eras. And if you want to explore what happened next, how Kievan Rus' evolved, how Byzantium fell, and how memory became myth, watch our other series on the rise of the Orthodox Slavic world and the legacy of the Byzantine Empire. Because sometimes, to understand how nations rise, we must follow the rivers back to where they began. This was the Eastern Viking Saga.